At my 68th birthday, my stepdaughter locked me outside and said this was a private family party. She looked me in the eye and told me I was just her mother's husband. I stood on the porch while her high society guests watched from the air-conditioned living room. Then the housekeeper made one quiet phone call. My late wife's final devastating instruction came out of the shadows. My name is Clifton. I am 68 years old. I spent my entire life building solid foundations so other people could stand tall. I thought I had built a family. I realized I had only built a target for greedy parasites. Before I continue this story of how I dismantled an arrogant betrayal piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who paid for the ground they stand on. The smoke from the barbecue grill drifted across the pristine patio. I stood on the back porch holding a heavy silver tray piled high with grilled ribs. I had spent 4 hours preparing the food for my own birthday celebration. I stepped toward the sliding glass doors leading into the grand dining room. Bradley stepped in front of the glass. He is my white son-in-law. He wore a tailored linen suit paid for entirely by my bank account. He looked at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated contempt. He grabbed the brass handle of the sliding door. He pulled it shut with a sharp thud. He engaged the heavy deadbolt. I stood frozen holding the tray. The lively chatter of 70 wealthy guests inside the house became a muted hum behind the thick, insulated glass. Monique stepped up right behind Bradley. She is my stepdaughter. She wore a designer dress that cost more than my first truck. She held a crystal flute of imported champagne. She did not look apologetic. She looked triumphant. Monique leaned closer to the glass. She spoke loudly and clearly so her voice would penetrate the barrier. She stated that this estate belonged to her bloodline now. She told me my presence was an embarrassing reminder of a past she wanted to erase. She ordered me to take my food and wait inside the garden shed at the edge of the property. She explicitly stated she did not want me ruining the aesthetic of her high society party. Bradley smirked. He stood there with a sickening sense of entitlement. He had never swung a hammer in his life. He had never built anything of value. Yet he locked the door of my home as if he had laid every brick himself. His pale face was flushed with the expensive whiskey I had stocked in the cellar. Monique's laughter echoed through the glass. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut right through my chest. She was celebrating my exclusion. She was proudly displaying her dominance to her friends, proving she had finally usurped the old man. Several guests glanced toward the porch. They saw an older black man locked outside his own home holding a tray of meat. They quickly looked away, sipping their drinks, entirely complicit in my public humiliation. I did not yell, I did not drop the tray, I did not bang my fists against the glass and demand entry. I simply stood there and looked down at my hands. My palms were thick with calluses. My knuckles were heavily scarred and permanently stiff from decades of manual labor. I spent 30 uninterrupted years securing grueling commercial construction contracts across the entire metropolitan area. I hauled heavy steel beams up freezing scaffolding. I poured concrete foundations in the dead of winter. I negotiated with ruthless property developers to build a massive contracting business from absolute zero. I bled into the soil to purchase this exact sprawling estate. Every brick, every imported Italian tile, and every crystal chandelier was paid for by the sweat off my back. Sylvia married me when Monique was exactly 5 years old. Sylvia was the absolute love of my life, but she arrived at my doorstep with nothing but a worn suitcase and a frightened child. I took them in without hesitation. I gave them my name. I gave them my protection. I gave Monique the world on a silver platter. When she demanded to attend a prestigious Ivy League university, I did not let her take out a single student loan. I wrote the massive tuition checks in cash every single semester for 4 straight years. I bought her first luxury car so she would not feel out of place among her wealthy classmates. I paid for the lavish $250,000 wedding where she married Bradley. I provided the heavy down payments for the endless string of failed tech business ventures Bradley constantly launched. I built the very floor they were standing on with my own blood. They believed my silence over the past year was a definitive sign of weakness. Since Sylvia passed away from a sudden illness, I had retreated deeply into my grief. I wore my old, faded work clothes around the property. I stayed entirely out of their way. I allowed Monique to host her weekly high society parties and pretend she was a self-made generational heiress. I genuinely thought giving her space would honor Sylvia's memory. I desperately thought my quiet patience would preserve the fragile remains of our family. I was profoundly wrong. My patience had merely emboldened a relentless parasite. I slowly lowered the heavy silver tray onto the outdoor patio table. The ribs I had cooked for hours cooled in the night air. I looked up and scanned the brightly lit interior of the house through the wide floor-to-ceiling windows. The massive kitchen was a flurry of chaotic activity as hired caterers prepared the next expensive course. Standing absolutely still by the marble island was Carmen. Carmen is my housekeeper. She had worked for Sylvia and me for 20 solid years. She was a silent, fiercely observant woman who knew every dark secret buried within the walls of this estate. She had watched Monique's toxic arrogance grow over the years. She had witnessed the subtle racial disrespect Bradley directed at me whenever Sylvia was safely out of the room. Carmen saw exactly what had just happened on the porch. She saw the heavy lock turn. She saw the cruel smirk on Bradley's face. She saw Monique raise her glass in victory. Carmen looked directly through the window. Her dark eyes locked perfectly with mine. We did not need to exchange a single spoken word. Her expression hardened into pure, cold resolve. She wiped her hands decisively on her apron. She turned her back on the noisy, distracted caterers and walked purposefully toward the private landline mounted on the kitchen wall. She picked up the receiver. She dialed a very specific, highly confidential legal number. It was a direct line to a senior partner at a downtown law firm. Sylvia had left strict, irrevocable instructions with Carmen weeks before she died. Sylvia knew her daughter's fatal flaw was an uncontrollable, blinding greed. Sylvia had established a dead man's switch, a legal mechanism designed to detonate the very moment Monique crossed a final, unforgivable line. Locking me out of the house I built on my own birthday was that exact line. I watched Carmen speak softly into the phone. She nodded once, hung up the receiver with a sharp click, and returned to chopping vegetables as if nothing had happened. The mechanism was officially activated. The silent adjustment had begun. I turned away from the brightly lit mansion. The evening air was crisp and biting. I walked across the manicured lawn toward the far back of the property. I headed straight for my personal workshop. The workshop was a heavy, reinforced steel structure I built myself decades ago. It was my absolute sanctuary. It was the only place on the entire 50-acre estate where Monique and Bradley never dared to tread. It housed my antique tools, my architectural blueprints, and my personal commercial safes containing my corporate bonds. I needed to secure my master financial ledgers immediately to prepare for the inevitable legal war that was about to consume this family. I walked with steady, deliberate steps, letting the anger crystallize into pure focus. I reached the edge of the thick tree line where the workshop stood, hidden in the deep shadows. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. The heavy-duty industrial padlock I had installed was completely destroyed. Shards of twisted metal littered the concrete step. Deep, violent gouges marred the steel frame where a heavy pry bar had been ruthlessly used to force the door open. I pushed the door wide open. The interior fluorescent lights were already blaring. The workshop had been aggressively breached. I walked past my overturned workbenches. I looked at the back wall. The thick biometric lock on my primary personal safe was drilled entirely out. The violation of my safe was not a random burglary. It was a targeted, precise strike. Someone knew exactly what to look for and exactly how to break through military-grade steel. I stared at the metal shavings scattered across the floor. The safe contained the physical deed to the estate and my bearer bonds. They had not just locked me out of the house. They were attempting to lock me out of my entire existence. I ran my fingers over the jagged edges of the drilled lock. The metal was still warm to the touch. Industrial tungsten bits had chewed completely through the hardened steel faceplate of my personal safe. It was a precision job. Whoever did this possessed the exact schematics of the locking mechanism and the right heavy-duty tools to bypass the secondary titanium security pins. I swung the heavy steel door wide open. The interior shelves were completely stripped bare. My corporate bearer bonds were gone. The physical deed to the 50-acre estate was missing. The original architectural blueprints I had drafted with my own hands had been tossed carelessly onto the concrete floor. They were trampled by expensive, dirt-stained shoes. They took the absolute foundation of my life and treated it like worthless scrap paper. The crunch of Italian leather on loose metal shavings broke the heavy silence of the workshop. I turned around slowly. Bradley stood in the doorway. He swirled amber liquid in a heavy crystal Scotch glass. It was my 20-year-old single malt. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He did not look like a man caught committing a major felony. He looked like an arrogant conqueror surveying a recently captured province. His tailored white linen suit was completely out of place in my sanctuary of sawdust, motor oil, and welding equipment. He smiled. It was a thin, bloodless smile that reeked of unearned privilege and deep-seated insecurity. He stepped over the threshold, violating the one space on this entire property that was exclusively mine. I demanded to know where my documents were. I kept my voice entirely level and devoid of emotion. A raised voice is a sign of lost control, and I never lose control in the face of an adversary. Bradley chuckled. He walked over to my heavy oak workbench and casually dragged his pristine fingernail across a thin layer of sawdust. He stated that his technology startup was currently facing a severe terminal liquidity crisis. He needed massive capital by Monday morning to appease a group of highly aggressive venture capitalists. He spoke about moving millions of dollars with the casual, careless indifference of a man who had never sweat for a single dime in his entire life. He informed me that his private banks required substantial hard collateral for an emergency commercial bridge loan. He decided my estate was the perfect sacrificial lamb for his financial salvation. I told him a physical piece of paper was completely useless without my authorized signature. I reminded him the property was locked behind a fortress of ironclad legal barricades and complex corporate trusts. Bradley took another slow sip of my scotch. He corrected me with a chilling, rehearsed smugness. He stated he already had my signature. He informed me he had successfully initiated a total title transfer of the estate earlier that afternoon. He did not forge my name on the deed. He simply bypassed me entirely. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the workbench right next to my scattered blueprints. It was a medical power of attorney. The document granted Monique and Bradley absolute, uncontested control over my legal, medical, and financial decisions. I stared at the bold black ink on the heavy stock paper. My mind raced backward to exactly 3 months ago. I had experienced a sudden, sharp flutter in my chest while unloading lumber from my truck. It was a minor arrhythmia brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. I drove myself to the hospital for a standard precautionary checkup. Sylvia had always made me promise to take my heart health seriously after she got sick. Bradley had met me at the emergency room that evening. He played the role of the deeply concerned, dutiful son-in-law perfectly. He brought me hot coffee. He spoke privately with the attending physicians in the hallway. He assured me he would handle the tedious discharge paperwork so I could rest my eyes. I trusted him. I let my guard down for exactly 1 hour while they monitored my vitals. Bradley leaned back against my heavy drill press. He proudly revealed exactly how he weaponized my brief moment of physical vulnerability. He used that hospital visit to establish a documented baseline of medical intervention. He then paid a massive, untraceable cash bribe to a disgraced private physician in the city. The doctor officially classified my minor heart flutter as a severe symptom of advanced rapid-onset vascular dementia. The fabricated medical report stated I was prone to violent cognitive breaks. It declared I was entirely incapable of managing my own complex assets. Bradley had legally declared me mentally compromised. He stripped me of my autonomy while I was sitting in a hospital bed trusting him with my basic discharge papers. I looked at this weak, arrogant man standing in my workshop. I spent 40 years fighting systemic prejudice in the brutal commercial construction industry. I outmaneuvered cutthroat developers who refused to shake a black man's hand. I built skyscrapers from the dirt up. I commanded crews of hundreds of men who respected nothing but hard work and unyielding integrity. Now a man who could not change a flat tire or swing a hammer was attempting to erase my entire legacy with a single fraudulent signature and a bribed doctor. Bradley stepped closer, closing the distance between us. He warned me not to fight the transition. He stated the house was already as good as sold. He told me to accept my new diminished reality. He ordered me to sit quietly in the garden shed until his private movers came tomorrow to clear out my remaining garbage. He instructed me not to embarrass Monique by showing my face to their wealthy guests ever again. I did not react to his blatant provocation. Panic is the ultimate enemy of strategy. I needed to cut off their financial oxygen immediately. My corporate bonds were stolen, but my primary liquid assets were secured in offshore and domestic banking trusts. I needed to freeze those primary accounts before Bradley's forged power of attorney penetrated the institutional banking firewalls. I reached into the front pocket of my work trousers. I pulled out my cell phone. Bradley watched me. He did not step forward. He did not try to snatch the device from my hands. His confident smirk widened into a full predatory grin. That relaxed smile was my first true warning. I dialed the 24-hour elite client line for my primary financial institution. I bypassed the standard operators and entered my top-tier priority access code on the keypad. I needed to speak to my personal wealth manager directly. I intended to initiate a total lockdown protocol. A red flag on the accounts would instantly halt any collateral inquiries Bradley was making for his failing tech startup. It would freeze the title transfer in its tracks. I held the phone to my ear. I expected the familiar ringtone of the executive desk. I received a sterile automated voice instead. The automated system asked me to verify my identity. I punched in my social security number and my 6-digit secure PIN. The machine paused. A sharp mechanical beep pierced my ear. The artificial voice informed me that my access credentials were unequivocally revoked. The system stated my accounts were currently frozen under a court-mandated psychiatric hold. It instructed me to have my registered legal guardian contact the fraud department during regular business hours to discuss account management. The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The digital screen faded to black. Bradley chuckled softly. He finished the last drop of my expensive scotch. He set the empty crystal glass down on my workbench right over the forged signature on the medical document. He told me the lock on the bank was significantly tighter than the lock on my personal safe. He turned his back on me and walked out of the workshop, heading back to the lavish party financed entirely by my stolen money. I stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lights of the breached room. I was completely locked out of my own life. They had severed my financial limbs with terrifying speed and devastating precision. I walked out of the breached workshop and headed straight for my truck. It is a 1998 Ford F250. The paint is heavily chipped. The suspension groans. The engine runs like an absolute fortress. I bought this machine the exact same year I secured my first multi-million-dollar city infrastructure contract. It is a vehicle built for enduring heavy, unforgiving loads. Right now, I was the heavy load. I climbed into the cab and gripped the worn leather steering wheel. I drove away from my estate. The night air whipped through the open windows, sharp and cold. I did not allow my mind to panic. Panic is a useless luxury reserved for the unprepared. My mind shifted immediately into absolute structural analysis. Bradley had severed my financial access. He had breached my physical safe. He firmly believed he had neutralized me. He forgot a crucial fact. A man who builds skyscrapers from the dirt up knows exactly how to tear them down to the foundational rebar. I navigated the empty highway toward the downtown financial district. The towering glass buildings reflected the harsh streetlights against the dark sky. I had poured the concrete foundations for 3 of those high-rises. I knew the heavy steel skeletons hiding behind the polished corporate glass. I knew how much pressure a structure could take before it completely collapsed. I parked my battered truck aggressively in the red loading zone of a high-end corporate law firm. I did not care about parking tickets or towing warnings. I had a war to manage. I walked through the revolving glass doors of the lobby. The environment was sterile, bright, and aggressively modern. A young security guard stood up behind a marble desk. He opened his mouth to demand my identification. I completely ignored his presence. I marched straight past his desk and down the mahogany-paneled hallway. I knew exactly where I was going. I pushed open the heavy double oak doors at the end of the corridor. Hayes sat behind a massive desk covered in legal briefs. Hayes is a brilliant, utterly ruthless defense attorney. We share a very specific background. We both fought our way up from neighborhoods where survival was a daily violent negotiation. He handled complex legal contracts. I handled stubborn union foremen. We have trusted each other with our lives for 2 decades. He looked up from his paperwork. He saw the cold, unyielding geometry of my expression. He immediately stood up and smoothed his tie. I walked directly to his desk. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas coat. I pulled out the shattered, heavy-duty tungsten lock I had retrieved from my personal safe. I slammed it down onto the polished wood of his desk. The heavy metal made a sharp, violently loud crack that echoed through the quiet office. Hayes stared at the broken mechanism. He did not ask how I was doing. He asked who broke the line. I told him Bradley had breached my workshop while hosting a party in my backyard. I told him the physical deed to the estate and my corporate bearer bonds were completely gone. I informed him my personal banking access was entirely frozen under a fraudulent psychiatric hold. Hayes did not waste a single second offering empty sympathy. He grabbed his encrypted laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision. He logged directly into the county's expedited real estate and probate registry. The silence in the office was suffocating. I watched the pale reflection of the computer screen in Hayes's glasses. His jaw tightened. A hard ridge of muscle formed on his cheek. He found the file. He turned the laptop around so I could clearly see the screen. The digital document displayed a formal expedited transfer of title. The 50-acre estate no longer listed my name as the primary owner. Bradley had moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. He used the fake medical power of attorney to completely bypass the standard 30-day waiting periods. Hayes pointed a pen at the bottom of the screen. He highlighted a specific commercial real estate listing. It was scheduled to go live on the multiple listing service at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Bradley and Monique were not just securing a quiet bank loan, they were liquidating the entire property immediately. They were hosting a high-stakes, exclusive open house event tomorrow. They intended to sell my home to private equity vultures for a fraction of its true value just to secure immediate, untraceable cash. Bradley needed the money to cover his massive embezzlement tracks before his tech startup faced a federal audit on Monday. He was deliberately burning my life to the ground to hide the ashes of his own failures. Hayes leaned back in his leather chair. He rubbed his temples vigorously. He reminded me of the ironclad legal barricades we had established years ago. When Sylvia and I got married, I wanted to merge our assets completely out of pure love and trust. Sylvia absolutely refused. She sat in this exact office 15 years ago and demanded Hayes draft the most aggressive prenuptial agreement legally possible. Sylvia looked me dead in the eye that day and told me her daughter possessed a bottomless, toxic greed. Sylvia knew Monique viewed me not as a father, but as a walking, breathing bank account. Sylvia explicitly designed the estate trust to protect my hard work from Monique's unchecked entitlement. She built an impenetrable legal fortress around my assets. But a fortress is completely useless if the enemy holds the keys to the front gate. Bradley had not broken the trust through a clever legal loophole. He bypassed the trust entirely by using the medical power of attorney. By having me legally declared a mentally compromised invalid, he seized the keys. He assumed full, uncontested control of the entity that owned the trust. It was a brilliant, highly malicious maneuver. I told Hayes to file an immediate emergency injunction to stop the open house tomorrow morning. I demanded he block the real estate sale before a buyer signed a contract. Hayes looked at me with grim, unflinching realism. He stated the brutal truth of the American legal system regarding elder care. A verbal denial from an angry 68-year-old man holds absolutely zero weight against a medically certified document signed by a licensed physician. The courts would look at my sudden outrage as exactly what Dr. Aris diagnosed: erratic paranoid dementia. Hayes explained that filing a standard legal injunction would take weeks to process through the heavily backlogged family courts. By the time a judge reviewed the case, the house would be sold to a shell company. The money would be funneled into offshore accounts. I would be permanently locked inside a heavily medicated psychiatric ward with no legal recourse. Hayes leaned forward and looked me dead in the eye. He stated we needed a smoking gun. We needed undeniable internal proof of the fraud to present directly to a federal judge tonight. We needed concrete evidence of the financial transaction between Bradley and Dr. Aris. Without that specific proof, Bradley's paperwork was legally bulletproof. We were entirely cornered. The air in the office grew heavy with impending defeat. The law was currently operating as a weapon against me. I needed a countermeasure that bypassed the corrupt medical evaluation entirely. At that exact moment, the silence in the room was shattered. My cell phone vibrated violently against the wood of Hayes's desk. The screen illuminated the dark office. It was a secure, encrypted text message. It was from Carmen. I opened the message. It contained a single heavy audio file. The silent adjustment had delivered its first weapon. I stared at the glowing screen of Hayes's laptop. The encrypted audio file sat perfectly centered on the display. Carmen had sent it directly to the secure server Sylvia established before her death. I spent decades hiring foremen, managing brutal construction sites, and observing human behavior. I learned a vital lesson early in my career. The people who sweep the floors, serve the meals, and maintain the background of your life hear absolutely everything. Arrogant men treat the working class like invisible furniture. Bradley treated Carmen like she was deaf-blind and completely irrelevant. He never realized she was the most observant person inside my house. She possessed a fierce loyalty to Sylvia that Bradley's money could never buy. She saw the true nature of his entitlement. Hayes clicked the mouse. The audio began to play. The recording was pristine. I instantly recognized the sharp acoustic echo of my own formal dining room. I had installed the vaulted oak ceilings myself to amplify the acoustics for Sylvia's lavish dinner parties. I knew exactly how sound traveled across those imported marble floors. Now those exact same acoustics captured the precise sound of my execution. I heard the unmistakable clinking of crystal glasses. Bradley was pouring drinks. He was acting the part of the gracious host in a house he did not build. Another voice spoke. It was smooth, heavily practiced, and entirely transactional. I knew that voice from the fraudulent medical evaluation currently sitting on Hayes's desk. It was Dr. Eris. Bradley spoke with the reckless confidence of a man who firmly believed his own fabricated reality. He stated he needed the medical classification finalized before the end of the week. Dr. Eris replied that a sudden onset vascular dementia diagnosis required substantial justification to bypass the state medical board's routine audits. Bradley laughed. It was a cold, metallic sound completely devoid of human empathy. Bradley stated he had 50,000 reasons to justify the paperwork. He told the doctor the cash was already wired to a designated offshore shell account. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair. I listened to a licensed medical professional sell my autonomy, my dignity, and my fundamental legal rights for $50,000. Dr. Eris assured Bradley the paperwork would withstand any preliminary judicial scrutiny. He guaranteed the psychiatric hold would neutralize my authority instantly. He promised Bradley total uncontested control over my medical directives and my financial assets. Dr. Eris asked a single question before leaving the dining room. He asked why Bradley was moving with such aggressive, reckless speed. Bradley's arrogant tone faltered. The protective facade cracked. The absolute truth spilled out into the hidden recording device. Bradley confessed that his highly publicized technology startup was completely bankrupt. It was an absolute financial illusion. He had no viable product. He had no revenue streams. He had systematically embezzled millions of dollars in seed capital. He used the investor funds to pay for his exclusive country club memberships, his imported sports cars, and the lavish lifestyle he desperately needed to impress Monique's shallow circle of friends. I gripped the armrest of my chair. My knuckles turned white. I spent my 20s hauling 100-pound bags of concrete up unstable scaffolding in the sweltering heat. I built my wealth by delivering tangible results and bleeding for every single dollar. I never spent a dime I did not physically earn. Bradley had built absolutely nothing. He was a hollow parasite feeding off the labor of better men. His recorded confession worsened. Bradley revealed the dark origin of his seed capital. He had not borrowed from standard commercial banks. He had taken millions from an aggressive private equity firm known for utilizing ruthless physical enforcement tactics to recover their bad investments. Bradley stated, his voice trembling with genuine terror, that the firm had scheduled a mandatory federal audit of his company for Monday morning. If he did not deposit the stolen funds back into the corporate accounts by Sunday night, he would face immediate federal prison time or severe physical retaliation from his dangerous creditors. He needed to sell my estate to cover his massive criminal tracks. He was deliberately burning my life to the ground to illuminate his own escape route. He planned to liquidate a multi-million-dollar property for a fraction of its true value just to secure immediate untraceable cash. He was willing to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life to avoid facing the consequences of his own theft. The audio recording clicked off. The silence in the law office returned. It was a heavy, loaded silence. I looked at Hayes. The dynamic had shifted entirely. We possessed the ultimate weapon. We had a crystal-clear recorded confession of criminal bribery, medical fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The medical power of attorney was entirely compromised. It was no longer a legal document. It was a confession of a major felony. I told Hayes to draft the federal injunction immediately. I wanted the FBI white-collar division breaking down the heavy oak doors of my estate before Bradley could serve the main course at his ridiculous open house. I wanted federal agents seizing his assets and placing him in handcuffs in front of his high society friends. Hayes nodded sharply. His fingers attacked the keyboard with ruthless speed. He began pulling the necessary federal forms to freeze the entire county real estate registry. The victory felt tangible in my chest. We had them completely cornered. We were about to drop a federal anvil on their entire fraudulent operation. Then a sharp, piercing alarm echoed from Hayes's desktop monitor. A bright red notification box flashed across the center of his screen. Hayes stopped typing instantly. His hands hovered frozen over the keyboard. He leaned close to the monitor. The color vanished entirely from his face. He stared at the screen as if it were a physical threat. I demanded to know what was happening. Hayes did not look at me. He stared at the flashing red text. He stated the title transfer had just cleared the final county approval process. I told him that was legally impossible. We had placed a preliminary alert on the deed requiring a secondary verification for any major transaction involving the property. Hayes shook his head slowly. He pulled up the final executed document and enlarged it on the screen. He pointed to the digital signature line. Monique had bypassed the security flags. She had filed the transfer using Sylvia's maiden name to bypass the automated legal filters. The county system processed the rapid transfer as a standard maternal inheritance claim. She exploited a microscopic gap in the probate registry. The digital stamp confirmed the transaction. The transaction was finalized and irreversible at the county level. The estate no longer belonged to my trust. It legally belonged to Monique and Bradley right at this exact second. Hayes looked up at me with grim, terrifying urgency. He stated they possessed the ultimate legal high ground. The house was theirs. The federal injunction based on the audio recording would take a minimum of 24 hours to process through the magistrate judge. Bradley and Monique did not need 24 hours. They had the full force of local law enforcement on their side right now. They possessed a legal deed and a medical document declaring me incompetent. They held all the functional power. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Monique. It contained a single high-resolution photograph. The image showed a private security team standing in my driveway. The men were armed and wearing tactical vests. The message below the photograph was simple and direct. It informed me my belongings were packed in garbage bags on the lawn. It stated I had exactly 2 hours to collect my garbage before the police arrived to arrest a trespasser. They had beaten us to the punch. The counterattack had failed before it even launched. I was entirely exposed. I drove my heavy work truck back through the wrought iron gates of the estate. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the meticulously graded gravel of the main driveway. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long and sharp shadows across the manicured lawns I had personally paid to maintain for 2 decades. The peaceful isolation of the property was entirely gone. 4 matte black vehicles were parked at aggressive tactical angles across the circular driveway, deliberately blocking the path to the main house. A team of private security contractors stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human barricade. They were dressed in matching black tactical gear with their arms crossed over their chests and their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Monique had not just hired standard security. She had hired expensive and aggressive muscles specifically instructed to intimidate an old man. I brought the truck to a slow and controlled stop. I turned off the ignition. The heavy diesel engine rumbled to a halt. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I looked at the security team through my cracked windshield. I evaluated their posture and their positioning and their sheer numbers. I spent my youth working on dangerous construction sites surrounded by volatile men. I learned early on that hired intimidation is entirely hollow when it faces absolute and unshakable resolve. I pushed the heavy metal door of my truck open and stepped out onto the gravel. The crisp evening air hit my face. I stood to my full height and looked directly at the barricade. The line of guards parted down the middle. Monique stepped forward from the shadows of the front porch. She walked toward me with the crisp and rapid strides of a woman who firmly believed she had completely won the war. Bradley lingered several paces behind her. He nervously checked his expensive gold watch. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly anxious about his own rapidly collapsing financial timeline. Monique did not possess any of his nervous energy. She stopped exactly 4 feet away from me. She held out a single piece of heavy stock paper. It was a formal and legally binding eviction notice. The thick black ink starkly outlined my immediate removal from the premises. I did not reach out to take the paper. I let her stand there holding it in the cold air. Monique dropped her arm and sneered. She spoke with a venomous and practiced precision. She stated clearly that the title transfer was completely finalized. She informed me that she and Bradley were the absolute legal owners of the entire property. She commanded me to listen to her terms without speaking a single word. She gave me exactly 2 hours to walk to my workshop to pack a single bag of personal belongings and to permanently vacate the estate. If I remained on the property 1 minute past the deadline, she would order the armed security team to physically throw me onto the public highway. She stepped closer and lowered her voice to a sharp and menacing whisper. She explicitly threatened that if I attempted to fight back or call the local police, she would immediately present the forged medical power of attorney to the responding officers. She promised to have me arrested for criminal trespassing and legally classified as a violent threat and permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward. She smiled a cold and victorious smile. She truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect and inescapable trap. I looked past her perfectly manicured face. I looked past the imposing line of hired security guards. I directed my gaze toward the southern border of the vast property. A magnificent row of massive oak trees stood tall against the fading light. Their thick and sprawling branches formed a solid canopy of green leaves. I planted those exact trees with Sylvia 20 years ago. We spent an entire grueling weekend digging the deep trenches by hand. The soil was incredibly dense and filled with heavy rocks. I remembered the sweat pouring down my face. I remembered Sylvia kneeling in the dirt beside me, gently guiding the fragile saplings into the ground. We packed the dark earth around the roots together. We stood up covered in mud and looked at our work. Sylvia leaned her head against my shoulder. She asked me to promise her that I would never let this estate fall into ruin. She asked me to protect the foundation we were building no matter what hostile forces tried to tear it down. Sylvia possessed a brilliant and analytical mind. She knew her daughter was deeply infected with an uncontrollable and destructive greed. She knew Monique would eventually try to burn everything we built just to warm her own hands. I looked at the thick and unyielding trunks of the oak trees. They had survived 2 decades of violent storms because their roots were anchored deep beneath the surface. I realized right then that walking away from this driveway was not an act of surrender. It was a tactical retreat necessary to detonate the final countermeasure. I did not argue with Monique. I did not waste my breath negotiating with a parasite. I simply nodded once. The minimal gesture clearly infuriated her. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to scream and validate her cruel exertion of power. I denied her that satisfaction. I turned my back on her and walked silently toward the rear of the property. The security guards shifted their weight, ready to intercept me, but Monique sharply waved them off. She ordered them to wait by the vehicles and watch the clock. I walked across the lawn and entered my breached workshop. The heavy steel door still hung awkwardly on its broken hinges from the earlier invasion. The interior space was a chaotic mess of overturned tools and scattered architectural blueprints. The drilled lock of my empty safe sat uselessly on the concrete floor. They thought they had stripped me of my absolute final line of defense. They were completely wrong. I walked to the back corner of the workshop. I pulled a heavy and dark green canvas duffel bag from a top storage shelf. I placed it firmly on a cleared section of my primary workbench. I began to pack with methodical and deliberate speed. I did not pack items of sentimental value. I packed items of pure utility. I placed a change of durable work clothes into the bottom of the bag. I added my most essential and precision hand tools. I packed a specific set of brass architectural calipers I had used to draft the original blueprints of this very estate. I gathered the physical artifacts of a man who built his life from scratch. The canvas bag was completely full within 20 minutes. I zipped it shut with a sharp and final pull. The physical packing was merely a distraction. I needed the security guards watching from the driveway to believe I was complying with their harsh ultimatum. I needed them to focus entirely on the duffel bag so they would not notice my true objective. I stepped away from the packed bag. I walked directly to the center of the room. I stood in front of a massive and industrial iron workbench. The heavy structure weighed easily over 400 pounds. Bradley had not bothered to search beneath it because he lacked the physical strength to move it a single inch. I planted my heavy work boots firmly against the concrete floor. I gripped the thick iron edge of the table. I dropped my center of gravity and engaged my legs and shoved the massive bench backward. The heavy iron legs shrieked loudly against the concrete. I pushed it exactly 3 feet to the left, exposing a section of the wooden floorboards I had installed myself. To the untrained eye, the oak planks looked completely seamless and entirely undisturbed. I knelt on the cold floor. I ran my calloused fingers along a specific and nearly invisible groove in the wood. I pressed down hard on a concealed pressure point. The short oak floorboard clicked sharply and popped upward. I removed the loose plank and set it aside. A dark and hollow cavity was hidden completely beneath the floor. Resting securely inside the dark space was a flat and heavy-gauge fireproof lockbox. I reached down and pulled the cold metal box out of the hole. I placed it onto the floor in front of me. I quickly spun the brass combination dials. I inputted a specific set of numbers Sylvia had whispered to me in her hospital room just days before she passed away. The heavy latch disengaged with a solid click. I opened the reinforced lid. Inside the box lay a thick and immaculate stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival parchment. It was the original and completely unmodified master trust document. Sylvia had drafted this exact legal framework entirely in secret, utilizing a ruthless team of corporate attorneys. She meticulously structured the estate ownership into an impenetrable ghost corporation. I lifted the heavy document from the box. The blue ink of Sylvia's precise signature caught the harsh light of the workshop. I slowly turned the thick pages. I bypassed the standard asset allocations and the standard inheritance protocols. I found the specific section Sylvia had warned me about. I read the dense and highly complex legal text of the lethal penalty clause. Sylvia had explicitly anticipated her daughter's exact crime. She knew Monique would eventually attempt to usurp the estate using fraudulent measures. The clause was an absolute and irrevocable trap. The legal text stated that any heir who attempted to initiate an unauthorized title transfer or forcibly remove me from the primary residence would trigger an automatic and immediate and total disinheritance. The master trust rendered the fast-tracked county deed completely null and legally void. I folded the heavy parchment carefully. I placed it deep inside the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. I hoisted the heavy duffel bag over my shoulder. I walked out of the breached workshop and headed back toward the armed guards waiting in the driveway. The trap was fully armed. I just needed Bradley and Monique to commit their final and inescapable federal crime tomorrow morning. I smoothed the heavy archival parchment over the scarred surface of my workbench. The thick, cream-colored paper felt dense under my calloused fingertips. I adjusted my reading glasses and focused on the intricate legal phrasing Sylvia had authorized. The text was dense, stripped of any emotional sentiment, and forged with absolute precision. She had anticipated every single move her daughter would make. Sylvia knew Monique viewed the world entirely through the lens of unearned acquisition. She knew that upon her death, Monique would immediately hunt for the physical deed to the estate. Sylvia had strategically left a highly convincing notarized decoy document in my main safe. It was a perfectly executed counterfeit designed to placate a greedy mind. The true ownership of the 50-acre property and the primary residence did not reside in a standard family trust. The document revealed that the estate was completely absorbed by a shielded, anonymous corporate holding entity. The ghost corporation was a legal phantom. It was buried beneath 4 distinct layers of out-of-state limited liability companies. It was invisible to standard county title searches and completely immune to external power of attorney maneuvers. By stealing the decoy deed and executing a rapid transfer of title, Monique and Bradley had acquired absolutely nothing. They had successfully transferred a worthless piece of paper. They held a fabricated title to a property that technically did not exist in the public registry. I ran my hand across Sylvia's blue ink signature at the bottom of the page. A sharp wave of profound respect washed over me. I vividly remembered the late evenings we spent in my home office 20 years ago. During the late 90s, my commercial construction firm faced relentless, highly aggressive, hostile takeover attempts from massive, predatory real estate conglomerates. These developers utilized ruthless litigation to absorb independent labor forces and strip valuable land assets. I spent months teaching Sylvia exactly how to build protective corporate shells. I showed her how to compartmentalize physical real estate assets within nested corporate structures to prevent hostile acquisition. We spent hours mapping out complex legal architectures on large whiteboards. I taught her how to build a financial labyrinth so dense that no hostile entity could ever locate the central vault. She was a brilliant, fiercely protective student. She absorbed every single tactical blueprint I shared. I realize now that she had weaponized my exact corporate defense strategy to construct a flawless trap for her own flesh and blood. She utilized the very armor I built to protect our business to protect me from her daughter. She knew my inherent instinct was to forgive, to absorb the blow, and to endure the disrespect. Sylvia engineered this master trust to execute the necessary punishment automatically. She designed the legal structure to drop a guillotine so I would never have to swing the blade myself. The sheer brilliance of the trap extended far beyond simple asset protection. I analyzed the cascading legal consequences of Bradley's recent actions. By legally declaring the title transferred, Bradley firmly believed he possessed the necessary collateral to save his failing technology startup. He had rushed to his private equity investors and his institutional banks. He used the fraudulent decoy deed to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. He pledged an asset he did not legally own to secure immediate capital across state financial lines. He had willingly walked directly into a catastrophic legal nightmare. A local property dispute regarding a contested deed is a minor civil matter handled in crowded county courts. It results in fines and protracted litigation. However, pledging a fabricated real estate asset to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan from a federally insured banking institution constitutes textbook wire fraud and bank fraud. The moment the loan funds touched his bankrupt corporate accounts, Bradley had instantly elevated a petty family theft into a severe mandatory minimum federal felony. They had unknowingly handed me the exact smoking gun Hayes desperately needed just an hour ago. They were no longer simply greedy heirs playing games with medical documents. They were active federal criminals operating a highly illegal financial scheme. I pulled my cell phone from my jacket pocket. I dialed Hayes directly on his personal encrypted line. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with the lingering frustration of our previous conversation. I did not offer any greetings. I immediately read the primary operational clauses of the master trust document aloud to him. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The heavy, oppressive silence of defeat that previously choked his office completely evaporated. He instantly recognized the monumental shift in our legal leverage. I instructed Hayes to compile the digital footprint of Bradley's commercial bridge loan application immediately. I ordered him to package the loan documents alongside the explicit proof of the Ghost Corporation's true ownership. I told Hayes to forward the entire dossier directly to his primary contacts within the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. I mandated that he bypass the local police authorities entirely. Local precinct detectives would simply tell us it was a civil family matter and refuse to intervene in an eviction dispute. The federal authorities possess the absolute jurisdiction to freeze Bradley's corporate assets instantly. Hayes confirmed the strategy with a sharp, predatory tone. He promised the digital package would hit the federal servers before midnight. The trap was locked. I terminated the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. I carefully folded the master trust document and secured it deep inside the interior pocket of my heavy canvas coat. I zipped up my green duffel bag. I slung the thick canvas strap over my right shoulder. I walked out of the breached workshop and stepped back into the cold night air. The private security guards tensed visibly as I approached the main driveway. They placed their hands near their tactical belts, anticipating a physical confrontation. I completely ignored their aggressive posturing. Monique had retreated inside the house to entertain her wealthy guests and celebrate her counterfeit victory. Bradley stood alone on the front porch. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his pristine linen trousers. He watched me approach the perimeter. He stepped forward to intercept me before I reached my truck. He looked at the single duffel bag hanging from my shoulder. A cruel, deeply satisfied smirk spread across his face. He mockingly advised me to secure a bed at the downtown homeless shelter before it filled up for the night. He told me to enjoy the harsh reality of my new pathetic existence. He radiated the false confidence of a man entirely blind to his own impending doom. I stopped walking. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I did not issue a threat. I did not demand respect or raise my voice. I simply stared at a man who was eagerly tightening a federal noose around his own neck. I nodded silently, acknowledging his insult without absorbing a single fraction of it. I turned away, climbed into the cab of my heavy work truck, and turned the ignition. The diesel engine roared to life, shattering the quiet evening. I put the truck into gear and drove slowly down the long, winding driveway. I watched the sprawling estate disappear in my rearview mirror. Leaving the property was not a defeat. It was the absolute necessary tactical requirement for the trap to spring entirely shut. If I stayed and physically fought the eviction, the local police would intervene and halt the impending real estate sale to preserve the peace. I needed Bradley and Monique to feel completely secure in their theft. I needed them to proceed aggressively with tomorrow's high-stakes open house event. I needed them to present the fraudulent deed to the private equity representatives in a highly public, thoroughly documented forum. Only their total, unhesitating commitment to the fraudulent sale would permanently seal their federal indictments. I drove onto the dark highway, leaving the arrogant completely alone to orchestrate their own spectacular destruction. I drove the Ford F-250 10 miles down the interstate, leaving the affluent zip code of my former estate far behind. I took the third exit toward the neglected outskirts of the city. I chose a rundown highway motel situated right off the off-ramp. It was a forgotten relic from the 1970s, featuring cracked asphalt and zero digital surveillance. I parked my work truck around the back, keeping it hidden behind a rusted commercial dumpster. I walked into the cramped lobby and paid for a corner room using crisp $100 bills. The bored clerk sitting behind the smudged plexiglass did not ask a single question. He handed me a heavy brass key attached to a faded plastic tag. I located room 114. The wooden door dragged stubbornly against the frayed carpet as I pushed it open. The room contained a sagging queen-sized bed, a bolted-down television, and a scuffed laminate table. It was Spartan, entirely anonymous, and absolutely perfect for my strict operational needs. I dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the mattress and pulled the thick blackout curtains shut. I turned on the single desk lamp. I was no longer an evicted old man. I was a structural engineer preparing to demolish a corrupt building. 45 minutes later, a sharp, rhythmic knock sounded against the thin door. 2 heavy strikes, a deliberate pause, and one final strike. It was the precise signal I had established with Hayes decades ago. I disengaged the rusted chain lock and pulled the door open. Hayes stepped inside, immediately scanning the perimeter. He wore a dark wool overcoat to obscure the bulky tactical equipment strapped across his shoulders. He locked the deadbolt behind him and dropped 2 reinforced Pelican briefcases onto the laminate table. Hayes operated beautifully in the dark trenches. He unlatched the waterproof cases and pulled out 2 high-end encrypted laptops. He extracted thick black cables, a portable cellular routing array, and a high-frequency signal scrambler. He plugged the router directly into the wall outlet and instantly engaged the scrambler. The small device emitted a faint electronic frequency that blanketed the motel room in a secure, impenetrable digital shadow. We were completely insulated from external cellular tracking or rogue GPS pinging. Hayes powered up the twin laptops. He typed long strings of complex decryption keys. He bypassed standard public internet protocols and tunneled directly into secured financial networks. The cheap motel room was officially transformed into a fully operational command center. We sat in hard plastic chairs and stared at the scrolling data populating the primary monitor. Hayes established a covert read-only digital backdoor into the county deed registry and Bradley's publicly listed corporate banking accounts. We watched Bradley's frantic, disorganized financial movements unfold in real time. Bradley was hemorrhaging capital and operating in a state of absolute panic. The cascading data streams showed multiple rapid-fire inquiries originating from predatory offshore lenders. Bradley was frantically attempting to leverage the newly acquired fraudulent estate deed to secure an immediate multi-million-dollar cash injection. He was desperately bouncing digital requests between anonymous holding companies trying to mask his massive embezzlement deficit before the federal auditors arrived on Monday morning. I watched the green cursor blink rhythmically as Bradley officially initiated a 7-figure collateral transfer request using Sylvia's stolen property title. He was transmitting counterfeit documents across heavily monitored federal banking wires. He was permanently cementing his own federal prison sentence with every single desperate keystroke. His blinding arrogance shielded him from the invisible legal tripwire he had just triggered. He firmly believed his fabricated medical power of attorney was a bulletproof shield. Suddenly, the secondary monitor on the edge of the table chirped with a high-pitched digital alert. A red map rapidly populated the screen, illuminating a precise grid of local highways. Hayes leaned forward and tapped his pen against the glass display. He stated that Bradley was actively pinging a commercial GPS tracking signal. Bradley was attempting to pinpoint the exact location of my Ford F-250. He needed absolute confirmation that I had fled the city and would not disrupt his critical financial operations scheduled for tomorrow. Hayes looked at me with a flash of genuine concern. He warned me that if Bradley located the truck parked outside this specific motel, he would immediately dispatch his private armed security contractors to silence me permanently. I did not flinch. I poured a glass of stale tap water from the bathroom sink and drank it slowly. I told Hayes to look significantly closer at the blinking green dot isolated on his digital map. Hayes adjusted his glasses, leaned into the monitor, and zoomed in on the specific longitudinal coordinates. The glowing green dot was not stationary. It was moving steadily eastward at 65 miles per hour. It was currently crossing the state line. I set the water glass down on the laminate table. I explained the precise situation to Hayes without emotion. Earlier that afternoon, while deliberately pretending to pack my hand tools in the breached workshop, I had conducted a tactical sweep of my vehicle. Bradley was arrogant, but he was also cowardly. A coward always seeks distant validation rather than facing a threat directly. I ran my calloused hands deep under the muddy rear wheel wells and along the greasy, exposed undercarriage of the heavy diesel truck. I found what I expected. It was a small magnetic battery-operated GPS transponder stuck firmly to the inner steel frame. Bradley had covertly planted it there days ago. I did not crush the device. Destroying the digital signal would have triggered an immediate localized panic response from his security team. Instead, I carefully removed the tracker. I walked down to the industrial rail yard located exactly 2 miles behind the southern estate border. I magnetically attached the active transponder directly to the steel underbelly of a massive cross-state freight train hauling heavy shipping containers toward the eastern seaboard. I learned this exact tracking evasion tactic 3 decades ago. During the cutthroat bidding wars of the mid-1990s, rival construction firms utilized aggressive corporate espionage to steal my supply chain routes and sabotage my midnight concrete deliveries. They routinely placed early-generation tracking devices on my heavy earth-moving machinery. I spent years identifying those rudimentary bugs and attaching them to outbound municipal garbage barges to send my enemies on expensive, humiliating wild goose chases. Bradley thought he was utilizing cutting-edge technology to trap an obsolete old man. He was simply repeating the exact same amateur mistakes my ruthless rivals made 30 years ago. Hayes watched the green dot cross into another state. He let out a low, sharp bark of laughter. Bradley was currently staring at his sleek smartphone screen, firmly believing I was driving halfway across the country in total exile. He felt entirely secure in his stolen castle. Hayes turned his attention back to the primary encrypted laptop. He cracked into the back end of the regional multiple listing service utilized by elite real estate brokers. He bypassed the security firewalls and pulled up the restricted listing for my estate. Bradley had bypassed the public market entirely. He was utilizing a shadow broker to host an aggressive invite-only open house event scheduled for high noon tomorrow. Hayes ran a rapid cross-reference on the digital guest list, matching the provided names against federal corporate databases. The color drained entirely from Hayes's face. He turned to me and stated the severity of the situation. Bradley had directly invited the senior managing partners of the ruthless private equity firm he had defrauded. He had pledged the estate directly to these dangerous men as hard collateral to cover his massive embezzlement tracks. The firm's representatives were arriving at the open house tomorrow to physically inspect the property and finalize the collateral transfer in person. They were bringing their own corporate security personnel. Bradley was attempting to hand over my home to financial predators to save his own life from federal prison. The stakes had instantly magnified. I stood up and buttoned my canvas jacket. I told Hayes to pack up the encrypted laptops. We were not going to hide in a forgotten highway motel. We were going to drive back to the estate and walk directly through the front oak door of that exclusive open house. I needed Bradley to present the fraudulent deed to those dangerous men in broad daylight. I needed the transaction to occur in public to permanently seal his federal wire fraud crimes. We were going to trigger the lethal penalty clause of the master trust right in front of his worst enemies. The midday sun glared off the polished hoods of a dozen high-end luxury vehicles parked along the curved gravel driveway. I drove my heavy work truck right past the line of imported sports cars and black executive SUVs. I parked my battered Ford directly on the pristine front lawn. I cut the engine and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I was not wearing my faded canvas jacket or my heavy work boots. I wore a tailored charcoal wool suit. I had not taken this suit out of its garment bag since the day I buried Sylvia. It was cut perfectly to my broad shoulders and thick frame. It was not the attire of a defeated old man begging for scraps. It was the absolute armor of a corporate titan arriving to reclaim his stolen empire. I walked toward the imposing front entrance with measured and deliberate strides. A private security team stood stationed around the perimeter of the porch. They were the exact same armed contractors Monique had hired yesterday. They recognized my face, but they were completely paralyzed by my transformation. They had been explicitly instructed to remove a homeless trespasser. They were entirely unprepared to intercept a man who walked with the absolute authority of the property owner. I did not break my stride. I did not offer them a single glance. I walked straight up the wide stone steps and pushed through the heavy oak double doors. I stepped across the threshold and entered the grand foyer. The interior of the house was a chaotic symphony of false wealth. Bradley had spared no expense to create an illusion of total financial solvency. A hired string quartet played classical music in the corner of the dining room. Expensive catered hors d'oeuvres circulated on silver platters carried by waiters in crisp white uniforms. The house was packed with wealthy prospective buyers and elite real estate brokers. Standing near the massive marble fireplace in the center of the grand living room was a distinct group of men. They did not wear bright colors or hold champagne glasses. They wore severe dark suits and possessed cold and evaluating expressions. They were the representatives from the ruthless private equity firm. They were not here to admire the architecture. They were here to physically inspect the massive asset Bradley had blindly pledged to them as collateral for his stolen millions. Monique was holding court near the grand staircase. She wore a bright crimson dress and held a delicate crystal flute of expensive champagne. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by a potential buyer. She turned her head toward the foyer. Her eyes locked entirely onto my face. The bright and arrogant smile vanished from her lips instantly. The color drained completely from her cheeks. Her fingers went entirely numb. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp sound of breaking glass caused a sudden ripple of silence to spread across the immediate area. Monique completely lost her refined composure. Her face contorted into a mask of absolute panic and rage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding that I leave the premises immediately. She shouted to the confused guests that I was a deranged trespasser who had lost his mind. She frantically plunged her hand into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She loudly announced to the entire room that she was dialing the local police dispatch. She demanded the authorities arrive instantly to arrest a violent intruder and drag me away in a straitjacket. She wanted to humiliate me in front of the exact people she was trying to impress. She desperately needed the private equity men to believe she was in total control of the estate. I completely ignored her shrill and echoing screams. I did not look at her. I did not attempt to defend myself against her frantic accusations. I simply walked forward. I counted my steps across the marble floor. 7 paces past the foyer. 3 paces to the right of the grand chandelier. I stopped walking. I planted my dress shoes precisely on the center of a specific dark marble tile. I knew this exact geographic coordinate better than anyone else on the planet. When I built this estate, I personally designed the complex acoustic layout of the grand living room. Sylvia loved hosting massive charity galas. She hated using electronic microphones to address her guests. I spent 3 full weeks calculating the precise angles of the vaulted oak ceilings and the curvature of the plaster walls. I engineered the room to possess a natural acoustic focal point. Anyone standing on this specific dark tile could speak in a normal conversational tone, and their voice would naturally amplify and bounce perfectly across the entire room. I had built a physical megaphone into the very foundation of the house. I stood on the focal point. I drew a deep breath into my chest. I spoke. I did not yell. I did not strain my vocal cords. I projected my voice with deep and resonant authority. The engineered acoustics of the room caught my words and carried them effortlessly over the panicked screams of my stepdaughter and the frantic whispers of the wealthy guests. My voice completely dominated the physical space. I commanded the absolute attention of every single person standing in the house. I bypassed the minor buyers entirely. I addressed the lead real estate broker standing near the fireplace. He was a slick and highly polished man wearing a bright blue suit. I also addressed the cold private equity representative standing directly behind him. I stated clearly that the open house was officially suspended. I announced that the property they were currently standing inside was the subject of an active and massive federal criminal investigation. The ambient noise in the grand room vanished entirely. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. The waiters froze, holding their silver trays. The lead broker stepped forward with a deeply offended expression. He demanded to know who I was and why I was attempting to sabotage a multi-million-dollar commercial listing. He stated he had personally verified the county title transfer just yesterday afternoon. He firmly believed the paperwork was immaculate. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit. I pulled out a thick and heavy legal document sealed with a certified red stamp. Hayes had drafted the notice in the motel room last night. It was a formal and legally binding notification of a fraudulent title transfer. I walked forward and pressed the heavy document directly against the broker's chest. I forced him to take it. I told him to read the bold print on the very first page. I informed him that the man who hired him to sell this house had utilized a fabricated medical document to bypass a master ghost corporation trust. I stated that Bradley had actively committed federal wire fraud and severe bank fraud by pledging an asset he did not legally own to a private equity firm across state lines. I warned the broker that if he facilitated the sale of this property for a single second longer, his entire real estate brokerage would be named as a direct co-conspirator in a massive federal indictment. I told him the FBI white-collar crime division had already received the unredacted digital ledgers. The slick broker looked down at the certified document. His eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text and the undeniable proof of the corporate trust structure. The arrogant confidence melted entirely from his face. His skin turned the color of wet ash. He was a man driven purely by commission, but he was not a fool. He instantly recognized the radioactive nature of the situation. He realized Bradley had lied to him. He realized he was standing in the middle of a burning federal crime scene. The broker dropped the document onto a nearby table as if the paper itself were physically burning his fingers. He turned toward his team of assistants and shouted a frantic command. He ordered them to pack up the promotional materials and cancel the event immediately. He declared the listing officially dead. He practically ran toward the front door to escape the impending legal fallout. The wealthy prospective buyers watched the broker flee in sheer terror. Wealthy individuals absolutely despise being entangled in complicated federal litigation. The mere mention of the FBI and wire fraud was enough to trigger a mass exodus. The guests dropped their champagne glasses on the tables. They grabbed their expensive coats and hurried aggressively toward the front doors. They shoved past each other in a desperate rush to escape the poisoned estate before the federal authorities arrived. The lavish and sophisticated open house completely disintegrated into a chaotic and humiliating stampede. The cold men from this private equity firm did not run. They stood perfectly still by the marble fireplace. They slowly turned their heads and locked their dead and evaluating eyes directly onto Bradley. They finally understood the truth. Bradley did not have the collateral he promised them. He had attempted to pay back his massive embezzled debt with a stolen and heavily contested property. He had blatantly lied to very dangerous men. The representatives did not shout. They simply turned around and walked out of the house in terrifying unison. Their silent departure promised severe and inescapable physical consequences. Bradley stood trembling near the shattered glass on the marble floor. His perfectly tailored linen suit hung awkwardly on his frame. The sophisticated mask of the wealthy technology entrepreneur had completely vaporized. He was entirely exposed as a bankrupt and desperate fraud. He watched his final chance at salvation drive away down the gravel driveway. He knew the private equity firm would send men to collect his debt tonight. He knew the federal auditors would freeze his accounts on Monday. His entire existence was permanently ruined. He looked at me standing calmly in the center of the grand room. His fear rapidly twisted into a blind and blindingly violent rage. He let out a raw and guttural scream. He clenched his hands into tight white fists. He lowered his head and charged directly across the marble floor, aiming the entire weight of his desperate body straight at my chest. Bradley crossed the grand living room floor with the reckless momentum of a man whose entire fabricated universe had just been irreparably shattered. His leather dress shoes slapped loudly and aggressively against the imported marble tiles. His expensive linen suit jacket flared out wildly behind him. His eyes were wide and completely devoid of any rational thought. He was operating purely on the blind feral panic of a cornered animal facing the absolute certainty of a federal prison cell and the impending physical retaliation of a defrauded private equity firm. I did not step back. I did not shift my weight to evade his chaotic flailing charge. I stood perfectly still on the acoustic tile in the center of the grand foyer and waited for the physical impact. Bradley slammed into me heavily. He threw both of his hands forward and gripped the lapels of my tailored charcoal wool suit. His knuckles turned stark white as he bunched the thick premium fabric tightly into his fists. He planted his feet and yanked his arms backward. He attempted to use his forward momentum and his gym-built mass to physically heave a 68-year-old man across the room and out through the heavy oak double doors. He let out a strained, guttural grunt as he pulled with every ounce of strength he possessed. I did not move a single inch. My heavy leather dress shoes remained entirely rooted to the marble floor. I did not flinch, sway, or stumble. The kinetic energy of his violent charge completely dissipated against my broad chest. Bradley's eyes widened in sudden terrifying realization. He pulled again. He planted his expensive shoes wider and strained his shoulders, his face turning a deep, volatile shade of crimson. He gasped for air, his perfectly white teeth gritted together in sheer frustration. He was completely baffled by the sheer immovability of my structural frame. He fundamentally misunderstood the true nature of physical strength because he had never actually worked a single grueling day in his entire life. Bradley possessed the inflated cosmetic physique of a wealthy, sheltered technology entrepreneur. He built his chest and his arms in exclusive climate-controlled fitness centers. He lifted perfectly balanced rubber-coated weights while watching financial news on high-definition flat-screen televisions. His muscles were purely decorative vanity muscles cultivated entirely for the shallow purpose of filling out expensive Italian suits and intimidating weak-minded investors in corporate boardrooms. They were soft, untested, and completely hollow under the pressure of genuine violent resistance. My strength was built upon an entirely different biological architecture. I spent the entirety of my 20s and 30s working on the most brutal, unforgiving commercial construction sites in the region. Long before I ever sat comfortably behind a polished executive desk, I hauled heavy steel I-beams across wet and unstable scaffolding in the freezing rain. I spent grueling 12-hour shifts operating massive industrial jackhammers, breaking thick concrete slabs until the violent mechanical vibrations numbed my arms completely to the bone. I carried 100-pound bags of raw, heavy cement on my shoulders up steep, temporary wooden staircases in the blistering summer heat. The sheer, unrelenting friction of that manual labor did not just build temporary aesthetic muscle. It actively fused my tendons. It calcified my joints. It packed my skeletal structure with a dense, permanent, and functional power that simply did not fade with age. My physical strength was born directly from brutal survival and sheer, uncompromising endurance. I looked down at Bradley's trembling hands gripping my lapels. I could feel the rapid, panicked fluttering of his pulse through the thick wool fabric of my suit. He was completely exhausted from merely trying to budge me from my position. His breathing was ragged and shallow. I decided it was time to put an end to his pathetic physical assault. I did not throw a wild punch. I did not need to exert any excessive energy or display any chaotic violence to neutralize the threat. I simply raised my hands and clamped my thick, calloused fingers directly over his wrists, my grip locked around his smooth, unblemished skin like heavy industrial steel vices. Bradley gasped loudly as the intense, crushing pressure instantly cut off his circulation. I did not squeeze simply to cause blunt surface trauma. I utilized the precise and unforgiving mechanics of structural leverage. I spent my entire life calculating weight distribution, stress fractures, and load-bearing angles. I knew exactly how physical structures collapsed when subjected to the correct directional force. The human skeletal system was no different than a poorly engineered support beam. I twisted my wrists sharply downward and rotated them inward. I applied severe and highly localized torque directly against the fragile carpal bones and tendons of his right hand. The mechanical leverage was flawless and absolute. The joint locked instantly reached its maximum physiological flexibility and then violently gave way. A sharp, audible pop echoed clearly across the grand foyer. Bradley released his grip on my coat instantly. A high-pitched, agonizing scream tore violently from his throat. The structural integrity of his wrist had completely failed. The blinding, sudden pain severed the motor functions in his legs. His knees buckled completely beneath him. He dropped like a heavy stone directly onto the polished marble floor. He landed squarely in the middle of the shattered crystal shards of Monique's dropped champagne flute. The sharp glass crunched loudly beneath his expensive linen trousers. He curled into a tight, trembling ball at my feet. He cradled his rapidly swelling right wrist against his chest, weeping openly and uncontrollably in front of the catering staff and the few remaining guests who had not yet fled. I stood over him perfectly calm and entirely unbothered. I reached up and methodically smoothed the rumpled fabric of my lapels. I adjusted the knot of my silk tie. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or explanation. He had initiated a physical conflict he was entirely unequipped to finish. The heavy, shocked silence of the grand room was abruptly shattered by the piercing, high-decibel wail of approaching sirens. The frantic, alternating shrieks of multiple emergency vehicles echoed rapidly up the long gravel driveway. Flashing red and blue emergency lights swept violently through the tall, arched windows of the foyer, casting chaotic, spinning shadows across the high plaster walls. Heavy tires screeched to a sudden and aggressive halt directly outside the front entrance, churning up the meticulously raked gravel. Heavy boots pounded rhythmically and urgently against the exterior stone steps. The heavy oak double doors burst open. 4 uniformed police officers rushed into the grand foyer. They moved with high alert tactical urgency. Their hands hovered instinctively over their heavy black utility belts, resting squarely on their holstered weapons. They rapidly scanned the chaotic, disrupted environment. They saw the shattered crystal glass scattered dangerously across the pristine marble. They saw the last stragglers of the wealthy prospective buyers huddled in terrified clusters near the rear exits. They saw me standing tall, composed, and completely still in the acoustic center of the room. And they saw Bradley weeping pathetically on the floor at my feet, tightly clutching his visibly injured arm. Monique saw the officers cross the threshold and instantly recognized her absolute last opportunity to salvage the disastrously collapsing situation. She sprinted frantically across the foyer, her expensive crimson dress swishing loudly around her ankles. She threw herself toward the lead patrolman. She manufactured a look of absolute hysterical terror with practiced precision. She pointed a perfectly manicured, trembling finger directly at my face. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding the officers draw their weapons to protect her. She claimed I was a violent, unhinged intruder who had just brutally assaulted her innocent husband without any provocation. She rapidly reached into her designer leather purse and retrieved the folded, official-looking document Dr. Aris had provided for $50,000. She thrust the fraudulent paperwork directly into the chest of the lead officer. She screamed that it was a court-ordered, fully authorized, and legally binding psychiatric hold. She yelled that I was suffering from a severe, highly violent dementia episode and posed a lethal threat to everyone in the room. She demanded that they place me in a heavy canvas straitjacket immediately. She ordered them to drag me out of her newly acquired house and lock me securely inside a restricted medical facility before I managed to kill someone. The lead officer took the heavy paper from her shaking hand. He unfolded it and quickly scanned the authoritative medical letterhead and the forged licensed signatures at the bottom of the page. The document looked entirely authentic to a patrolman responding to a chaotic domestic disturbance call. It possessed the correct county administrative seals and the aggressive standardized legal phrasing necessary to mandate an involuntary medical detainment. The officer looked up from the fraudulent psychiatric hold. He looked at Monique's highly convincing fabricated tears streaming down her face. He looked at Bradley bleeding and whimpering helplessly on the shattered glass. Finally, his eyes locked onto me. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The officers did not ask me for a statement. They did not request my side of the story or attempt to de-escalate the situation verbally. They relied entirely on the signed medical directive Monique had shoved into their hands. The lead officer nodded sharply to his partners. They moved forward in perfect, practiced synchronization. They unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The metallic ratcheting sound echoed clearly in the tense flashing light of the foyer. They stepped forward, forming a tight, inescapable semicircle around my position. They raised their hands and issued loud, commanding orders. They ordered me to turn around immediately. They ordered me to place my hands flat behind my back and interlock my fingers tightly. They explicitly warned me that any physical resistance or sudden movements would be met with immediate and overwhelming physical force. Monique stood safely behind the protective line of blue uniforms. She clutched her designer purse tightly to her chest. A cold, victorious smirk broke through her manufactured tears. She firmly believed the trap had finally snapped completely shut. She believed her forged medical paperwork had successfully neutralized the architect of her destruction. The officers closed the final distance, stepping carefully over the broken glass, their steel handcuffs fully drawn and ready to permanently deploy. The officers closed the final distance, stepping carefully over the broken glass, their steel handcuffs fully drawn and ready to permanently deploy. I watched the lead officer's eyes lock onto my wrists. I knew the exact protocol for dealing with armed, highly adrenaline-fueled law enforcement. A single sudden twitch, or an aggressive defensive posture, would grant them the immediate legal justification to tackle me to the marble floor. I did not give them that excuse. I maintained my absolute, unshakable composure. I held my hands in plain sight, resting them lightly against the tailored fabric of my suit jacket. I took one single, slow, and highly deliberate step backward. It was not a retreat born of fear. It was a calculated maneuver to establish a fractional buffer of physical space. Monique shrieked from her safe position behind the wall of blue uniforms. She demanded they stop hesitating and throw me to the ground. She wanted the immediate violent spectacle of my subjugation. The lead officer ignored her shrill commands. His training dictated that he assess the immediate threat, and I was projecting the exact opposite of violence. I spoke in a calm, flat, and deeply resonant tone. I informed the officers that I was fully prepared to comply with their directives, but I requested permission to present a single legally binding document from my interior coat pocket. The lead officer paused. He gripped the heavy steel cuffs tightly in his right hand. He rested his left hand securely on the butt of his holstered service weapon. He nodded once, granting me a strict and highly monitored margin of movement. He explicitly warned me to move with extreme caution. I moved my right hand at a glacial, transparent pace. I slipped my fingers inside the breast pocket of my charcoal wool suit. I bypassed the folded master trust document and grasped a different, equally lethal piece of paper. I withdrew a thick, heavy stock blue folder. The embossed gold seal of the premier neurological institute in the state caught the bright light of the grand chandelier. I extended my arm slowly and handed the thick dossier directly to the lead officer. I instructed him to review the certified medical findings inside before he made a catastrophic legal error based on Monique's purchased forgery. The officer accepted the folder. He kept his peripheral vision entirely locked on me while he opened the cover. He flipped past the official title page and began to read the dense, highly detailed medical summary. The document was a pristine, comprehensive neurological evaluation. It was completely unassailable. It explicitly detailed my exceptional cognitive health, my flawless memory retention, and my absolute psychological stability. The summary was signed, stamped, and authenticated by the chief of neurology at the state's most prestigious research hospital. It was not a superficial 10-minute clinic assessment. It was the result of a grueling 5-hour battery of rigorous psychological and physiological tests. The officer's eyes darted between the fraudulent psychiatric hold Monique had shoved into his hands and the pristine neurological dossier I had just provided. The chronological discrepancy was undeniable and completely fatal to Bradley's entire scheme. Dr. Aris's hastily fabricated report was dated a mere 48 hours ago. My certified neurological evaluation was dated exactly 7 days ago. It established a hard, irrefutable medical baseline that proved the sudden, aggressive onset of vascular dementia outlined in Monique's document was a complete clinical impossibility. The comprehensive evaluation utterly and entirely invalidated the $50,000 forgery. I had not subjected myself to that grueling neurological exam to prepare for Monique's inevitable betrayal. I secured that specific documentation strictly to protect the lifeblood of my commercial construction firm. In the high-stakes arena of industrial contracting, a man operating in his late 60s is constantly viewed as a potential liability by massive corporate bonding companies. Securing the necessary surety bonds for multi-million-dollar government infrastructure projects requires absolute documented proof of ongoing executive competence. The corporate underwriters demand to know that the man signing the contracts possesses the cognitive elasticity and the psychological endurance to oversee massive logistical operations. I learned decades ago that the only effective shield against aggressive corporate vultures was preemptive bulletproof documentation. I treated my own medical records with the exact same ruthless precision I applied to load-bearing architectural blueprints. I proactively updated my cognitive evaluations every 2 years to ensure no rival firm could ever challenge my executive authority in a boardroom. Sylvia always admired my rigid adherence to defensive preparation. She knew that my commercial contracting armor would eventually become the exact weapon necessary to dismantle her daughter's fraudulent crusade. Monique and Bradley believed they were outsmarting a vulnerable, isolated old man. They had actually challenged a veteran corporate architect who spent his entire life building impenetrable fortresses. The lead officer finished reading the final page of the neurological summary. The rigid, aggressive tension in his shoulders completely vanished. He lowered the steel handcuffs to his side. He looked at the forged psychiatric hold in his left hand with a sudden expression of deep professional disgust. He realized he had been actively manipulated into functioning as an armed enforcer for a malicious domestic conspiracy. He turned his head and shot a hard, commanding look at the 3 other officers surrounding me. He gave them a sharp, silent physical signal. The officers immediately broke their aggressive formation. They took 2 synchronized steps backward and holstered their restraints. They had completely stood down. Monique watched the tactical retreat in absolute, uncomprehending horror. Her meticulously constructed reality was collapsing directly in front of her eyes. She lunged forward, her expensive dress swishing violently. She screamed at the lead officer, demanding to know why they were backing away. She pointed frantically at my chest and yelled that I was a dangerous lunatic who had severely broken her husband's wrist. She insisted her medical document was the only valid authority in the room. The lead officer turned to face her. His voice was cold and entirely devoid of the previous deference he had shown her. He held up the thick blue folder. He informed Monique that my certified state-level neurological evaluation directly contradicted her sudden psychiatric emergency. He stated clearly that they were no longer dealing with a medical crisis. They were dealing with heavily conflicting legal documentation which instantly transformed the eviction attempt into a highly volatile civil dispute. He warned her firmly to step back and lower her voice before she was cited for interfering with a police investigation. Monique stood frozen, her mouth open in a silent, jagged gasp. The absolute authority she thought she had purchased had completely evaporated. She looked down at Bradley, who was still weeping pathetically on the shattered glass, clutching his broken wrist. The illusion of their total victory had shattered just as thoroughly as the crystal champagne flute. It was the precise moment to deliver the final, inescapable blow. I reached into the right pocket of my tailored trousers. I pulled out my smartphone. I did not ask the officers for permission. I did not offer any verbal explanation to preface my action. I simply maximized the internal volume settings on the device. I remained firmly planted on the exact acoustic focal point of the vaulted living room. I pressed my thumb against the digital play button on the screen. The pristine, unedited audio recording from Hayes's law office flooded the grand foyer. The acoustics of the carefully engineered room amplified the sound, perfectly projecting the digital file with crystal clear fidelity. Bradley's desperate recorded voice bounced sharply off the high plaster walls and echoed across the marble floors. Every single person remaining in the vast room heard the undeniable sound of his arrogant confession. The audio played his exact, unredacted conversation with Dr. Eris. Bradley's metallic, heartless laugh echoed through the house. The officers listened in absolute stunned silence as the recorded Bradley explicitly detailed the $50,000 bribe. They heard him boldly confirm the offshore shell account. They heard him explicitly instruct the licensed medical professional to falsify a sudden onset dementia diagnosis to bypass the state medical board audits. They heard the doctor guarantee that the fraudulent psychiatric hold would permanently neutralize my authority and grant Bradley uncontested control over my financial assets. The recording captured the very essence of a major premeditated felony. It was not a vague implication or a circumstantial piece of evidence. It was a direct, highly detailed verbal confession of criminal bribery, medical fraud, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. The audio file clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The police officers did not move for a long, heavy second. They processed the sheer magnitude of the criminal scheme they had just unwittingly walked into. The lead officer slowly turned his body away from me. He lowered his gaze and locked his eyes entirely onto Bradley. The dynamic of the room had inverted completely. I was no longer the suspect. I was the primary victim and the star witness. The lead officer did not utter a single word to Bradley. He immediately reached up to the radio microphone clipped securely to his uniform shoulder. He pressed the transmission button. He spoke with rapid, strict professional urgency. He called directly into the central dispatch. He requested an immediate supervisor response to the estate. He requested a dedicated medical transport unit for a suspect with a fractured wrist. He explicitly reported that his unit had just secured a live active scene involving a massive medical fraud and extortion conspiracy. Monique stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. She backed away from the police officers until her spine hit the cold plaster of the foyer wall. She stared at the blue uniform of the man calling in her total destruction. On the cold marble floor, amidst the glittering shards of broken glass, Bradley's discarded smartphone suddenly illuminated. A harsh electronic ringtone pierced the heavy tension of the room. The caller ID flashed brightly against the cracked screen. It was the private equity firm. The men who had just walked out the front door were already making their first collection call. Bradley lay on the floor, cradling his broken wrist, weeping loudly as the phone rang endlessly, signaling the absolute and violent end of his fraudulent life. The shrill electronic ringtone of Bradley's discarded smartphone continued to pierce the heavy silence of the grand foyer. The device lay on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the glittering, shattered remains of the crystal champagne flute. The bright screen illuminated the faces of the 4 police officers standing in a loose perimeter. They watched the spectacle unfold with grim professional detachment. They had completely abandoned their aggressive tactical posture. My pristine neurological evaluation rested securely in the hands of the lead officer. The forged psychiatric hold was completely dead. The trap had inverted. The ringing phone demanded an answer. The caller ID flashed the name of the senior managing partner of the ruthless private equity firm. The exact same men who had just walked out of my house were now demanding their stolen millions. Bradley groaned in absolute agony. He remained curled on the floor. His perfectly tailored linen suit was stained with a mixture of his own sweat and tiny droplets of blood from the broken glass. He cradled his swollen, disfigured right wrist against his chest. His chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. He knew exactly who was calling him. He knew the terrifying men on the other end of that cellular connection did not tolerate failure, and they absolutely did not tolerate theft. He squeezed his eyes shut tightly, desperately, hoping the ringing would simply stop. The phone did not stop. It demanded accountability. I stood motionless on the acoustic focal point of the living room. I looked down at the pathetic shell of a man bleeding on my floor. I spoke with absolute, uncompromising authority. I commanded him to answer the phone. I told him that ignoring the architects of his financial ruin would only accelerate his physical destruction. Bradley opened his tear-filled eyes. He looked at the glowing screen with sheer terror. He slowly uncurled his body. He extended his uninjured left hand toward the device. His fingers trembled violently as they brushed against the cracked glass screen. He swiped the green icon to accept the call. He lacked the physical strength to lift the heavy device to his ear. He pressed the speakerphone icon instead. The action amplified the caller's voice perfectly across the quiet, vaulted room. A deep, harsh, and heavily graveled voice exploded from the small speaker. The private equity investor did not offer a greeting. He did not ask about Bradley's health or his current location. He launched immediately into a vicious, high-decibel verbal assault. The man screamed through the digital connection with a level of pure, unadulterated fury that made the seasoned police officers flinch. He demanded to know exactly what kind of suicidal game Bradley was attempting to play. He stated that the firm's representatives had just walked out of a canceled open house after discovering the pledged real estate collateral was entirely fraudulent. The investor did not stop there. The true magnitude of Hayes's digital execution was finally revealed. The angry voice roared that an anonymous source had just dumped a massive, highly encrypted financial dossier directly onto the private servers of Bradley's entire corporate board of directors. The digital package had arrived exactly 30 minutes ago. It contained the unredacted banking ledgers, the offshore shell account routing numbers, and the explicit, undeniable proof of Bradley's systematic embezzlement. The investor screamed that the federal auditors were no longer waiting until Monday morning. They were freezing the corporate accounts at this exact second. Every single dollar Bradley had stolen was currently being tracked by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bradley gasped for air. He tried to speak. He tried to formulate a cohesive lie to stall the inevitable execution. He managed to stammer a pathetic plea for a 24-hour extension. He promised he could secure the necessary funds. He swore he could leverage another asset. The investor cut him off with a chilling, deadpan promise. The screaming stopped entirely. The man lowered his voice to a cold, predatory whisper. He informed Bradley that the time for financial restructuring was permanently over. He stated that the firm was no longer interested in securing a legal judgment or pursuing a civil lawsuit. He explicitly promised severe, immediate, and extremely violent physical consequences. He told Bradley that men were already dispatched to locate him. He advised Bradley to look over his shoulder for the rest of his very short life. The call disconnected with a sharp, heavy click. The dial tone echoed softly across the marble floor. Bradley dropped the phone. The device clattered against the stone tiles. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of ash gray. His jaw hung slack. His eyes stared blankly ahead into the void of his own permanent destruction. Bradley had spent his entire adult life carefully constructing an impenetrable social armor. He built his entire identity on the grand illusion of inherited wealth and effortless technological success. He utilized imported sports cars, exclusive country club memberships, and tailored designer suits to mask his fundamental lack of substance. He desperately needed the world to view him as a visionary genius. He required the constant shallow validation of his elite social circle to function. Without the stolen money financing his lavish charade, his entire persona completely disintegrated. He possessed no genuine skills. He possessed no actual business acumen. He possessed no real friends. He was entirely empty. The illusion was dead. He was now just a terrified, bankrupt criminal facing a massive federal indictment and the lethal wrath of a defrauded private equity syndicate. The paralyzing shock slowly mutated into a volatile, desperate rage. Bradley needed a scapegoat. He needed a target to absorb the crushing weight of his monumental failure. He could not attack me. I had just broken his wrist and dismantled his entire empire without breaking a sweat. He could not attack the police officers standing just feet away. He turned his wide, unhinged eyes toward the only other person involved in the conspiracy. He locked his gaze onto Monique. Monique was still pressed firmly against the plaster wall of the foyer. She clutched her expensive designer purse tightly against her chest. She watched Bradley's transformation with growing horror. Bradley struggled to his feet. He swayed unsteadily, favoring his broken arm. He pointed his uninjured left hand directly at his wife. He unleashed a torrent of venomous accusations. He screamed that this entire catastrophic failure was completely her fault. He blamed her for introducing him to the fraudulent scheme. He claimed her mother's fake deed was a deliberate, malicious trap designed to ruin his flawless reputation. He shouted that Monique had assured him the real estate transfer was completely secure and entirely untraceable. He yelled that her reckless greed had destroyed his company, his wealth, and his freedom. He called her a pathetic, useless parasite who had dragged him down into a federal nightmare. Monique's meticulously crafted facade of the elegant, wealthy heiress violently snapped. She was a woman driven purely by entitlement and profound narcissism. She absolutely refused to accept any accountability for the disaster. She refused to be publicly humiliated by a man she viewed as a mere financial utility. Her fear instantly converted into a blazing defensive fury. She marched directly across the shattered glass. She closed the distance between them in 3 rapid, aggressive strides. She did not yell back. She did not engage in a frantic verbal argument. She raised her right hand and delivered a vicious, full-force slap directly across Bradley's face. The sharp, cracking sound of the physical impact echoed loudly through the grand room. Bradley stumbled backward, completely stunned by the violent strike. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his pale cheek. Their fragile parasitic alliance shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the police officers. They were no longer a united front of wealthy elites executing a hostile takeover. They were 2 cornered criminals viciously turning on each other to survive. Monique stood over him, breathing heavily. She looked at the police officers. She saw the sheer contempt in their eyes. She looked at the dropped phone on the marble floor. She suddenly realized the absolute severity of her own legal exposure. She had actively presented a forged medical document to sworn law enforcement officers. She had attempted to initiate a fraudulent psychiatric detainment. She was entirely complicit in the massive wire fraud conspiracy. The federal authorities would not stop with Bradley. They would thoroughly investigate the origin of the counterfeit deed. They would uncover her direct involvement in the theft of my estate. She was facing her own lengthy federal prison sentence. Her survival instinct engaged with terrifying speed. She knew Bradley was a completely sunken ship. She could not rely on him to protect her. She needed a new strategy instantly. She needed to manipulate the only man in the room who possessed the ultimate authority to dictate the narrative. She turned her body away from her weeping husband. She faced me directly. The blazing, aggressive fury vanished from her features in a fraction of a second. She manufactured a new, highly convincing mask of absolute terror and vulnerability. She forced her eyes to widen. She commanded tears to well up and spill dramatically over her eyelashes. Her lower lip began to tremble perfectly. She wrapped her arms around her own torso, projecting the image of a helpless, terrified victim caught in a web of her husband's deceit. She took a slow, hesitant step toward me. She ignored the police officers entirely. She spoke in a soft, broken, and pleading whisper. She called me by my first name. She claimed she had absolutely no idea what Bradley was planning. She swore she was entirely innocent. She manufactured a pathetic story about Bradley controlling her finances and forcing her to comply with his abusive demands. She begged me to protect her from him. She begged me to tell the officers that she was just a frightened bystander. She played the role of the devoted, manipulated stepdaughter with sickening perfection. She was desperately attempting to use my lingering memory of her mother to secure her own salvation. Monique let the sharp, echoing crack of her vicious slap fade completely into the cold expanse of the grand foyer. She did not spare a single downward glance at Bradley weeping pathetically on the shattered crystal. He was entirely useless to her now. He was a rapidly sinking vessel, and she possessed a ruthless, deeply ingrained instinct for self-preservation. She turned her entire body away from her bleeding husband to face me. The volatile, defensive fury that had propelled her hand across Bradley's jaw vanished with chilling, immediate speed. She engineered a masterpiece of emotional manipulation right in front of the 4 armed police officers. Her posture shifted drastically. Her shoulders slumped forward to project absolute crushing defeat. Her legs buckled completely beneath the expensive fabric of her crimson designer dress. She dropped heavily and dramatically onto the polished marble tiles directly at my feet. She ignored the sharp, jagged fragments of broken champagne glass pressing dangerously into her bare knees. She reached out with both trembling hands and grabbed my right hand. Her manicured fingers dug desperately into my thick, calloused skin. She tilted her perfectly contoured face upward. Her eyes were completely flooded with heavy, cascading tears. She let out a ragged and utterly fabricated sob. She cried out my name. Her voice was not the sharp, entitled, and venomous weapon she had wielded against me just yesterday on the front porch. Her voice was artificially small, incredibly fragile, and entirely broken. She clutched my hand tighter, pressing her wet cheek against my knuckles in a desperate display of subservience. She began to weave a frantic and intricate tapestry of total victimhood. She invoked Sylvia's name instantly, using her dead mother as a psychological shield against her own federal crimes. She sobbed that Sylvia would be absolutely horrified and deeply heartbroken by the catastrophic events unfolding in the foyer. She claimed she had been trapped in a terrifying, inescapable state of psychological captivity. She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger backward at the sobbing form of Bradley. She swore to me and to the surrounding law enforcement officers that she had absolutely no knowledge of his federal wire fraud or his massive corporate embezzlement schemes. She painted a vivid and entirely fictional picture of severe domestic terror. She stated that Bradley had systematically and aggressively isolated her from the family finances over the past 3 years. She claimed he had violently forced her to procure the fraudulent psychiatric hold under the strict constant threat of physical abuse. She wept that she was currently heavily medicated on stress-induced anxiety prescriptions and completely incapable of understanding the highly complex legal documents he forced her to sign. She looked deeply into my eyes, amplifying the flow of her tears, and begged me to protect her from the impending wrath of the federal authorities. She begged me to let her keep the estate to preserve her mother's legacy. She promised with hysterical intensity that she would immediately file for divorce against Bradley and spend the absolute rest of her life honoring Sylvia's memory. She swore she would finally become the loving, respectful, and devoted daughter Sylvia always desperately wanted her to be. I looked down at the weeping woman kneeling on the shattered glass of her own ruined celebration. I felt the wetness of her manufactured tears against the back of my hand. I observed the perfect rhythmic trembling of her lower lip. I listened to the desperate and catching breaths she intentionally drew into her chest to simulate a panic attack. It was a flawless, highly polished theatrical performance. It was also a performance I had witnessed in its exact, precise entirety 15 years ago. During the late summer of 2011, I had spent 3 grueling years meticulously restoring a vintage 1968 Ford Mustang. I rebuilt the entire engine block entirely by hand and sourced original era-specific leather for the interior upholstery. I spent countless midnights polishing the chrome bumpers until they perfectly mirrored the sun. It was my absolute pride and joy, a tangible reward for decades of brutal physical labor. Monique was 22 years old at the time. She took the keys from my home office desk without asking my permission or showing a shred of respect. She drove the powerful muscle car to an exclusive high-society country club party simply to impress her shallow, wealthy friends. She drove it home heavily intoxicated and slammed the heavy vintage vehicle directly into a massive brick retaining wall at the edge of the neighborhood. She completely totaled the front end, shattered the engine block, and warped the custom chassis beyond any hope of mechanical repair. When I found her standing next to the smoking, ruined wreckage, she dropped to her knees in the driveway. She grabbed my hand. She wept with the exact same perfectly trembling lip. She swore she was swerving rapidly to avoid a stray animal darting into the road. She claimed she was terrified of the police and begged me not to tell Sylvia the absolute truth about her severe intoxication. I was a foolish, highly hopeful stepfather back then. I desperately wanted to build a bridge of trust with my wife's inherently hostile daughter. I absorbed the massive financial loss without a single complaint. I lied directly to the insurance company investigators. I protected her from all the severe legal consequences of driving under the influence. I fell completely and blindly for the tears of a highly skilled emerging predator. I did not feel a single trace of that foolish, naive hope today. The corporate and emotional armor I wore was completely impenetrable. I looked at the tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, analytical detachment. I clamped my left hand firmly over her trembling wrists. I peeled her desperate fingers off my skin with slow, unyielding, and mechanical force. I pulled my hand completely away from her grasp, ensuring no physical contact remained. I took a single and highly deliberate step backward to permanently sever the connection. The sudden physical rejection caused her fabricated sobs to falter for a fraction of a second. A brief and terrifying flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed her eyes before she aggressively forced the mask of victimhood back into place. I spoke in a low, flat, and deeply resonant voice that carried absolute and heavy finality. I did not address the stunned police officers standing in the periphery. I spoke directly and exclusively to the parasite kneeling on my floor. I told her that she was severely overestimating her own acting abilities and fundamentally underestimating my intelligence. I told her that I possessed a flawless photographic memory for disrespect. I instructed her to cast her mind back exactly 3 weeks ago to the formal catered dinner she hosted in this very house. I recounted the precise, undeniable events of my 68th birthday party. I reminded her of the exact moment I stood silently in the shadows of the adjacent dining room listening to her speak to her shallow circle of friends. I repeated the exact and venomous words she used to describe my existence. I reminded her that she explicitly told her wealthy guests that I was not a father figure, not a partner to her mother, and certainly not a respected commercial architect. She had called me a temporary unwanted squatter. She had called me just her mother's husband. She had explicitly stated she was eagerly counting the days until she could throw me onto the street and permanently scrub my cheap, working-class stench from the pristine walls of the estate. Monique stared up at me in absolute paralyzing silence. Her jaw trembled violently, but no manipulative words materialized to counter my absolute factual recounting. The manufactured tears completely stopped flowing, drying instantly against her pale skin. The horrific realization that I had heard her vicious, unvarnished confession weeks ago struck her like a physical, devastating blow to the chest. She understood instantly that her current performance was entirely useless and her exposure was total. I looked down at her kneeling form and delivered the ultimate lethal truth. I informed her that I was not the only person in this house who saw entirely through her hollow, greedy, and purely transactional soul. I told her that her mother had spent the final 5 years of her life watching in silent agony as her daughter mutated into a destructive and heartless monster. I stated clearly that Sylvia anticipated this exact, pathetic theatrical performance with mathematical precision. Sylvia knew her daughter would eventually attempt to violently steal the estate and then aggressively play the weeping victim when the fraudulent theft inevitably collapsed. I reached my right hand deep into the interior breast pocket of my tailored charcoal wool suit. I grasped the heavy folded archival parchment. I pulled the thick certified document out into the bright, unyielding light of the grand chandelier. I unfolded the heavy paper with a sharp snap and held it out directly in front of her face. I informed Monique that she was looking at the original, unmodified, and federally shielded master trust document. I told her it contained a specific and lethal penalty clause drafted explicitly by Sylvia's corporate attorneys to completely and permanently disinherit any heir who attempted an unauthorized title transfer or an illegal eviction. I watched the absolute last remaining spark of hope vanish entirely from Monique's eyes as the weight of her permanent destruction settled over her. I held the crisp, heavy archival paper directly under the bright light of the grand crystal chandelier. The vast foyer was completely silent, save for Bradley's pathetic, muffled sobbing on the floor and the heavy, synchronized breathing of the 4 police officers. They stood entirely frozen, captivated by the sudden legal execution taking place right in front of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject any gloating or theatrical emotion into my delivery. I read the text with the cold, sterile precision of a corporate auditor finalizing a massive bankruptcy proceeding. I recited Section 7, Paragraph 4 of Sylvia's Master Estate Trust. It was a self-executing poison pill clause. The legal language was immaculate and entirely devoid of any exploitable loopholes. It explicitly stated that any designated heir who attempted to initiate a hostile eviction forcibly remove me from the primary residence or legally contest. The established chain of title would instantly trigger a total, automatic, and irrevocable disinheritance. I looked down at Monique. I translated the dense legal terminology into the harsh, inescapable reality of her new existence. I informed her that the exact moment she shoved that forged psychiatric hold into the chest of the lead police officer, she had activated the guillotine. The master trust was directly linked to the estate's primary financial holding accounts. The penalty clause did not require a judge's signature to take effect. It did not require a protracted court battle or a board meeting. It was completely automated. I told her that her guaranteed 50% share of the multi-million-dollar estate was legally vaporized. The generous $10,000 monthly stipend she had relied upon for the last 5 years was permanently terminated. The corporate leases on her luxury vehicles were actively being canceled by the trust administrators. She had spent her entire morning orchestrating a hostile takeover and had successfully managed to completely bankrupt herself in front of an audience. My eyes traced the bottom of the heavy parchment. Resting just below the certified notary seal was Sylvia's signature. The dark ink was slightly uneven. The loops of her cursive handwriting were jagged and fragile. I knew exactly why that signature lacked its usual bold, confident stroke. Sylvia had signed this exact document in a sterile, brightly lit room in the oncology ward during the absolute final weeks of her life. She was severely weakened by aggressive chemical treatments. The relentless hum of the medical monitors had served as the soundtrack to her final days. But while her physical body was failing, her mind remained as sharp and unyielding as a diamond cutter. I had stood by the hospital window during that meeting, watching the city traffic below, completely unaware of the lethal legal snare she was constructing with Hayes. Sylvia knew me better than I knew myself. She knew that my entire fundamental nature was built around construction, preservation, and repair. I was a man who fixed broken things and absorbed collateral damage. She had watched me silently absorb the massive financial blow 15 years ago when a heavily intoxicated Monique had completely totaled my custom-built vintage 1968 Ford Mustang. She had watched me silently endure years of Monique's calculated disrespect at family dinners and holiday gatherings without ever raising my voice or demanding an apology. Sylvia recognized that my capacity for forgiveness was a profound liability. She knew that once she was gone, Monique would relentlessly exploit my patience. Monique would interpret my silence as weakness and my grace as an open invitation to attack. Sylvia refused to let her daughter destroy the man who had brought her peace. She designed the master trust to do the punishing for me. She engineered a legal structure that required absolutely no input, no anger, and no active defense on my part. She built an automated fortress around my existence, ensuring that if Monique ever decided to strike, the trap would snap shut with lethal and permanent force. The sheer crushing weight of the absolute financial evaporation slammed into Monique. I watched the realization saturate her brain. The elaborate, highly practiced mask of the terrified, abused victim simply dissolved. The fake tears that had been pooling in her eyes vanished, leaving her gaze dry, hard, and terrifyingly cold. She stopped trembling. She stopped invoking her mother's memory. The pathetic whimpering act was completely useless, so she discarded it instantly. Her posture shifted with rapid, aggressive violence. She pushed herself up from the marble floor. She completely ignored the sharp shards of broken crystal that sliced shallowly into her bare knees and the palms of her hands. A drop of blood trickled down her shin, ruining her expensive crimson dress, but she did not even register the physical pain. Her sadness evaporated into pure, unadulterated, and venomous rage. Her face contorted into a hideous, feral sneer. The elegant high society heiress was dead. She was entirely exposed as a hollow, cornered predator who had just realized her hunting grounds were completely barren. She understood the absolute totality of her ruin. Bradley's stolen corporate millions were currently being seized by federal agents. The private equity firm was actively hunting him down. Her mother's vast fortune was permanently locked away behind an impenetrable legal wall. She had no secret offshore accounts. She possessed no marketable skills. She had never worked a single hour in her entire adult life. She was entirely and profoundly destitute. The reality of impending poverty hit her like a physical shockwave. Her country club memberships, her designer shopping sprees, and her sycophantic circle of elite friends were gone forever. Blind, frantic greed completely overrode whatever fractional logic remained in her mind. If she could not have the estate, she needed portable, untraceable wealth. She needed immediate liquidity to flee the catastrophic fallout of her husband's collapsing empire. Her eyes darted wildly around the grand foyer before snapping directly toward the sweeping mahogany staircase. I knew exactly where her panicked mind had gone. The master suite at the top of the stairs housed Sylvia's personal floor safe. Inside that reinforced steel box sat a collection of flawless antique diamond jewelry worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Lining the upper gallery walls leading to that suite were 4 original authenticated post-impressionist oil paintings Sylvia had acquired at auction decades ago. Monique intended to sprint upstairs, tear the heavy gilded frames from the walls, empty the safe, and vanish into the city to fence the stolen assets on the black market before the federal authorities could freeze her physical movements. She let out a raw, animalistic snarl and lunged forward. She attempted to sprint past me, her high heels slipping wildly on the polished marble. She moved with chaotic, desperate momentum, her eyes locked entirely on the prize at the top of the stairs. I did not rush. I did not mirror her frantic panic. I simply stepped sideways with calculated geometric precision. I planted my broad shoulders and my heavy frame directly at the base of the mahogany staircase. I became an immovable physical barricade blocking her only path to the upper floors. Monique slammed to a halt just inches from my chest. She raised her hands, curling her manicured fingers into tight, violent claws, preparing to physically tear her way through me to reach the gallery. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving with exertion and pure malice. I looked down at her contorted face. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not flinch from her raised claws. I spoke with absolute crushing calmness. I advised her to stop completely. I informed her that storming the gallery was a spectacularly useless endeavor. I told her that every single original painting in this house, including the specific artwork she planned to strip from the gallery walls, was heavily monitored. I explained the security protocol with slow, deliberate enunciation. I told her that passive microscopic RFID tracking chips were woven directly into the canvas fibers of the paintings. I stated that the entire collection was globally insured and strictly registered with the International Stolen Art Database. I warned her that the moment a canvas crossed the exterior threshold of the estate without an authorized digital handshake, a silent alarm would deploy. I informed her that if she removed a single piece of art from this property, she would not be fencing luxury goods. She would be actively transmitting her precise geographic coordinates directly to a federal art theft task force. Monique stared at me, her chest heaving, the reality of the microchipped artwork paralyzing her feet on the bottom step of the mahogany staircase. She was completely trapped. Before her frantic mind could formulate a secondary escape route, a deep, rhythmic vibration rumbled through the floorboards of the grand foyer. It was a heavy, mechanized sound that entirely overpowered the idling engines of the local police cruisers parked outside. The distinct, aggressive crunch of thick off-road tires tearing into the manicured gravel driveway echoed loudly through the heavy oak doors. Powerful halogen headlights sliced through the tall front windows, instantly drowning out the spinning red and blue emergency lights. 4 massive, unmarked black SUVs moved in perfect aggressive synchronization. They did not park politely along the circular drive. They executed a tactical perimeter maneuver, jumping the pristine curbs and angling their reinforced steel grills directly toward every potential exit of the estate. The absolute finality of their arrival hung heavily in the crisp evening air. The heavy doors of the tactical vehicles swung open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents poured out onto the gravel. They did not wear the standard patrol uniforms of the local police currently standing inside my house. They wore dark, heavy tactical gear with reinforced Kevlar vests, prominently displaying the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, securing the perimeter of the property in a matter of seconds. Stepping out from the passenger side of the lead vehicle was a man who required no tactical armor. He wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. It was Hayes. He walked up the wide stone steps behind the federal strike team with the calm, measured stride of an executioner arriving to perform a routine administrative task. Long before Hayes ever established his highly lucrative private corporate practice, he had spent a brutal and highly distinguished decade serving as a senior federal prosecutor in the white-collar crime division. He possessed a vast, deeply entrenched network of federal judges, lead financial investigators, and elite forensic auditors. He knew exactly which precise legal levers to pull, which encrypted files to expedite, and which specific federal magistrates to wake up in the middle of the night to secure an immediate multi-agency raid. He had not simply submitted the embezzlement evidence to a generic tip line. He had hand-delivered a flawless, prosecution-ready digital dossier directly to his former colleagues. He bypassed months of bureaucratic red tape, practically guaranteeing an instant tactical response to secure the stolen corporate funds before Bradley could route them to non-extradition countries. The federal agents pushed effortlessly through the front entrance, immediately flooding the grand living room. The 4 local police officers instinctively took a step back, instantly recognizing the overwhelming jurisdictional override. They lowered their hands from their utility belts and deferred entirely to the federal raid team. The lead FBI agent, a tall, severe man with a hardened jawline and cold eyes, did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or de-escalation tactics. His gaze swept the room and locked immediately onto Bradley, who was still trembling on the marble floor near the shattered crystal. The agent marched directly across the foyer. He pulled a thick, tightly folded document from his tactical vest. He stood towering over the broken technology entrepreneur and read the federal warrant aloud. His voice was a booming mechanical instrument of the United States justice system. He formally charged Bradley with 7 counts of aggravated wire fraud, 3 counts of international bank fraud, and the grand embezzlement of over $40 million from a federally insured corporate entity. 2 heavily armed agents stepped forward and grabbed Bradley by the shoulders of his ruined linen suit jacket. They hauled him violently to his feet. They did not care about his fractured right wrist. They twisted his arms behind his back with practiced, unyielding force and clamped heavy federal steel around his wrists. Bradley let out a sharp, agonizing shriek of physical pain as the metal bit into his swollen joint, but the sound was quickly swallowed by a tidal wave of pure, unfiltered venom. As the agents prepared to drag him toward the waiting black SUVs, Bradley completely snapped. His psychological collapse was absolute. He turned his head and locked his bloodshot eyes onto Monique. He unleashed a horrific, deafening string of vile obscenities directly at his wife. He screamed that her insatiable greed had dug his grave. He shouted that if she had not constantly pressured him to elevate her social status, he never would have touched the corporate accounts. He roared that her malicious plan to illegally leverage the estate with a fraudulent deed was the exact catalyst that exposed his offshore shell companies to the private equity firm. He cursed her mother. He cursed her absolute uselessness. He spat violently onto the marble floor at her feet, blaming her entirely for the fact that he was about to spend the rest of his natural life rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The local police officers, the federal agents, and the remaining catering staff stood back and watched the complete and utter disintegration of the parasitic marriage without a shred of sympathy. Monique pressed herself against the mahogany banister. She ignored her husband's deranged, echoing screams as the agents physically dragged him out through the double doors and shoved him roughly into the back of a reinforced transport vehicle. She genuinely believed she had survived the blast radius. She firmly believed the federal authorities were solely interested in the corporate embezzlement and the financial crimes associated directly with Bradley's technology firm. She took a slow, calculated breath and attempted to smooth the wrinkled fabric of her crimson designer dress. She adjusted her posture desperately, trying to resurrect the arrogant, untouchable heiress persona. She took one confident step toward the front door, fully intending to walk out of the estate, hail a private car, and disappear into the city to regroup and calculate a new parasitic strategy. The lead FBI agent smoothly stepped sideways, instantly blocking her path to the exit. He did not look at her with any hint of respect, pity, or courtesy. He unzipped a secondary compartment on his tactical vest and produced another thick legal document. He held it up directly in front of Monique's face. He informed her that she was not leaving the premises. He explained that he possessed a secondary sweeping asset forfeiture warrant authorized directly by a federal judge. He delivered a cold, rapid lesson in the absolute crushing power of federal criminal statutes. He stated that any physical item, property, or liquid asset purchased, maintained, or improved using Bradley's embezzled corporate funds was now the immediate legal property of the United States government. Monique stared at the warrant in absolute paralyzing disbelief. The agent gestured sharply to his team. 6 agents immediately bypassed the foyer and marched heavily up the grand staircase. They were not looking for hidden criminals. They were executing a systematic wall-to-wall asset seizure. The lead agent looked directly at the keys dangling from Monique's manicured fingers. He demanded the electronic fob for the imported luxury SUV parked on the gravel driveway. He explicitly informed her that the vehicle's lease had been paid directly through Bradley's compromised corporate accounts. It was instantly confiscated. Monique's hand trembled violently as she dropped the heavy key fob into the agent's outstretched palm. The sounds of heavy, methodical confiscation echoed from the master suite upstairs. The federal agents were systematically clearing out the massive walk-in closets. They were seizing her extensive collection of Italian designer shoes, her silk evening gowns, and her dozens of exclusive imported leather handbags. They were pulling the velvet-lined jewelry boxes from the dressing room drawers, actively cataloging every diamond necklace, every sapphire tennis bracelet, and every platinum watch Bradley had purchased to maintain the grand illusion of his wealth. They boxed the items into heavy plastic evidence containers, ensuring every single asset was secured for federal auction to repay the defrauded investors. The lead agent reached forward and firmly grasped the strap of the expensive designer purse Monique was currently clutching against her chest. He pulled it effortlessly from her grip. He unceremoniously dumped the contents onto a nearby foyer table. He confiscated her platinum credit cards, her thick wad of cash, and her expensive smartphone. He informed her that the purse and all corresponding financial instruments were officially categorized as evidence of money laundering and receiving stolen property. Monique stood completely frozen in the center of the grand foyer. The air was entirely knocked out of her lungs. The sheer, overwhelming scale of her destitution finally crushed her. She was not just losing her guaranteed monthly stipend from the master trust. She was actively being stripped of every single material possession she had accumulated over the past 3 years. She watched the federal agents carry large sealed plastic bins down the mahogany staircase filled to the brim with her luxury items. She had no car to drive. She had no purse, no access to credit, no identification, and absolutely zero cash. The expensive crimson dress currently clinging to her body stained with her husband's blood, and the dirt from the floor was literally the absolute only possession she was legally allowed to keep. She had attempted to forcefully evict me from my own home and walk away with a multi-million-dollar estate. Instead, she was leaving the property with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back, facing the terrifying reality of the cold, unforgiving pavement. The federal agents operated with terrifying mechanical efficiency. They moved rapidly and aggressively past Monique without offering her a single peripheral glance. They carried heavy, sealed plastic evidence bins filled to the absolute brim with her seized designer wardrobe, her imported shoes, and her confiscated diamond jewelry. The lead federal agent walked purposefully out the front double doors, joining his heavily armed tactical team in the idling black SUVs. The massive vehicles aggressively reversed off the manicured front lawn. Their thick off-road tires crunched loudly against the meticulously raked gravel as they accelerated down the long, curving driveway. They took Bradley, his shattered corporate empire, and the entirety of Monique's stolen material wealth with them into the dark suburban night. The flashing red and blue emergency lights of the remaining local police cruisers illuminated the grand foyer, casting long, stark, and chaotic shadows across the shattered crystals scattered wildly on the polished marble floor. Hayes stood perfectly composed near the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase. He snapped the latches of his slim premium leather briefcase shut with a sharp, echoing click. He walked calmly and deliberately toward the lead local police officer. Hayes did not ask for a professional favor. He initiated a strict formal legal procedure. He withdrew a pristine, heavily stamped document from his jacket and handed it directly to the patrolman. It was a finalized, judge-approved eviction order. The document explicitly named Monique and mandated her immediate, unconditional, and physical removal from the private property. The officer carefully reviewed the judicial signature and the embossed county seal. The initial jurisdictional confusion was completely resolved. The federal authorities had systematically gutted the overarching financial conspiracy, and now the local authorities were legally obligated to enforce the strict civil boundaries of the estate. The lead officer turned his imposing uniformed frame directly toward Monique. She remained entirely frozen in the acoustic center of the grand foyer. The officer spoke with harsh, unyielding, and absolute authority. He explicitly informed her that her legal right to occupy the premises had been officially and permanently terminated by a sitting judge. He ordered her to turn around and walk out the front doors immediately. He delivered a cold professional warning that any hesitation, any verbal argument, or any refusal to comply with his direct verbal commands would result in her immediate physical arrest and subsequent booking for criminal trespassing. Monique did not move a single inch. Her brain was completely short-circuiting under the crushing, unimaginable weight of her instantaneous destitution. She had no designer leather purse to grab from the entryway table. She had no electronic key fob to retrieve for a luxury vehicle. She possessed absolutely no physical items to pack into a suitcase. The officer did not tolerate her paralyzing shock or her lingering hesitation. He stepped forward with heavy tactical boots and placed a firm, authoritative hand directly onto her bare shoulder. He physically rotated her body toward the exit. He marched her forcefully across the foyer, guiding her rigidly over the broken champagne glass and out through the heavy oak double doors. The officer released his tight grip on her shoulder the exact fraction of a second her expensive high heels crossed the stone threshold. He immediately stepped backward into the warm interior of the foyer and stood silently beside me. Monique stumbled slightly and awkwardly on the uneven hand-cut slate of the grand porch. The crisp, unforgiving chill of the evening air slammed violently into her exposed skin. She wore only the thin, ruined fabric of her crimson designer dress. She wrapped her bare, trembling arms tightly around her torso. Her entire body began to violently shiver. from the sudden temperature drop, the absolute loss of her social armor, and a massive, crippling adrenaline crash. The local police officers did not linger to monitor her psychological collapse. They had executed the eviction order flawlessly and securely returned control of the property to its rightful owner. They turned around, walked out the front doors, and descended the wide stone steps in perfect synchronization. They climbed into their respective marked cruisers, shut the heavy metal doors, and shifted their vehicles into gear. Monique watched in absolute paralyzing horror as the police cruisers drove away. Their bright red taillights faded completely into the dark, tree-lined suburban street. She was entirely and profoundly alone. She was marooned on the vast, empty gravel driveway of the massive estate she had maliciously plotted to steal. She slowly turned her shivering body around to face the open doorway. I stood, tall, broad, and completely silent within the warm, brightly lit foyer. The stark, undeniable contrast between my secure, fortified position and her bleak, utterly unprotected reality was absolute. The arrogant, wealthy, and untouchable heiress was permanently dead. She was now simply a desperate, freezing woman facing the terrifying prospect of surviving the night on the dangerous city streets with absolutely zero financial resources. She walked hesitantly toward the open double doors. She stopped exactly at the edge of the stone threshold. She was absolutely terrified to cross the legal boundary and trigger an immediate police response. Her teeth chattered audibly in the quiet night air. The meticulously applied, highly expensive makeup on her face was completely ruined, smeared by her earlier fabricated tears and her current genuine panic. She looked up at me. She dropped every last remaining ounce of her manufactured pride and her weaponized entitlement. She began to desperately beg. She did not ask for the house. She knew the estate was an impenetrable, legally fortified fortress. She pleaded purely for basic, immediate survival. She begged me for a temporary financial loan. She swore frantically that she would find a job tomorrow morning and pay me back every single cent. She asked for enough cash to hail a private cab to the city. She asked for enough money to secure a cheap roadside motel room for a single night. She frantically negotiated her own worth, dropping her financial requests lower and lower when I remained entirely rigid and unresponsive. She begged for a microscopic fraction of the monthly stipend she had comfortably burned on luxury shoes just weeks prior. Her voice cracked, echoing pathetically and weakly in the cold night air. I looked at her shivering figure standing on the pristine stone porch. I did not feel a single tremor of sympathy. My mind effortlessly and vividly transported me backward in time. I remembered standing on this exact geographic coordinate exactly 1 week ago. It was a humid, stifling evening. I had spent 6 grueling hours standing over a hot charcoal smoker in the backyard, carefully preparing a massive heavy tray of premium slow-cooked ribs for the exclusive dinner party she was hosting. I had walked around the perimeter of the house and climbed these exact stone steps carrying the heavy, aluminum-covered tray in both calloused hands. I had reached the front entrance only to discover the heavy oak doors were firmly locked from the inside. I had stood on the porch, my hands burning from the intense heat of the metal tray, and looked directly through the tall glass windows. I had seen Monique standing in the brightly lit foyer. She was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. She was surrounded by her wealthy, parasitic friends. She had looked directly through the glass at me standing outside in my faded canvas work jacket. She had not moved to unlock the door. She had not offered an apology. She had simply smirked, raised her champagne glass in a highly mocking toast, and turned her back. She had intentionally locked me out of my own home to publicly demonstrate her absolute dominance, leaving me isolated in the dark while she consumed the food I had labored to provide. The visceral memory crystallized my internal resolve into pure, unyielding steel. The cyclical, inescapable nature of justice had brought us back to the exact same threshold, but the positions were permanently and violently reversed. I did not waste my breath lecturing her on morality or the inevitable consequences of karma. I did not raise my voice to validate her frantic, shivering begging. I simply reached my right hand into the interior breast pocket of my tailored charcoal wool suit. I bypassed the heavy master trust document. I withdrew my slim, dark leather wallet. I opened the wallet with slow, methodical, and mechanical precision. I bypassed the heavy stack of high-denomination $100 bills. I extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I held the green paper out across the threshold. Monique stared at the small denomination in absolute disbelief. It was an amount of money she would have previously considered entirely insulting to leave as a restaurant tip. Now it represented her entire global net worth. Her shivering hand reached out slowly. Her manicured fingers clamped desperately onto the edge of the bill. She pulled it quickly from my grasp, clutching it tightly against her freezing chest. I looked her directly in the eyes. I delivered my final permanent instruction. I told her that the city bus stop was located exactly 1 mile down the main suburban road. I informed her that the $20 bill would adequately cover the night fare to the downtown transit center. I did not offer her a heavy winter coat. I did not offer her the use of my telephone. I took one slow, highly deliberate step backward into the warm, secure foyer of my estate. I gripped the thick brass handle of the heavy oak door. I swung the massive wooden panel forward with forceful momentum. The heavy door slammed firmly into the reinforced door frame, instantly cutting off the sight of her shivering form in the dark. I reached forward and engaged the heavy steel deadbolt. The mechanical mechanism slid into place with a sharp, echoing click. It was a sound of ultimate, absolute finality. The heavy steel deadbolt slid into place with a sharp and echoing mechanical snap. That single metallic sound marked the absolute and permanent conclusion of Monique's parasitic reign. I turned my back to the heavy oak double doors and looked out across the grand foyer. The chaotic, deafening storm of the past hour had completely passed. The federal agents were gone. The flashing emergency lights no longer painted the high vaulted ceilings with frantic red and blue shadows. The slick real estate brokers, the ruthless private equity men, and the sycophantic party guests had all scattered into the night like terrified insects. The massive estate was entirely silent. It was not the oppressive, hostile silence that had suffocated me over the past 3 years. It was the deep, resonant stillness of a structural foundation that had finally settled back onto solid bedrock. I walked slowly across the imported marble floor. I stepped carefully around the shattered shards of crystal glass still glittering near the entryway. I surveyed the grand living room. Bright neon federal seizure tags hung from the backs of the imported leather sofas and the antique mahogany display cabinets. The FBI had meticulously cataloged every single physical asset Bradley had purchased with stolen corporate funds. The room looked like an active crime scene stripped of its false prestige. The illusion of inherited wealth had been thoroughly dismantled, leaving behind only the stark architectural bones of the house I had built. A soft, hesitant shuffling sound broke the absolute quiet. I turned my head toward the arched entryway leading to the massive chef's kitchen. Carmen stepped slowly into the soft glow of the grand chandelier. She wore her faded gray uniform and held a simple wooden broom tightly in both hands. Her knuckles were pale from the nervous strength of her grip. Her dark eyes darted anxiously around the vast room, lingering heavily on the bright federal seizure tags attached to the expensive furniture. She looked like a survivor stepping out of a storm shelter to survey the catastrophic wreckage. She stopped at the edge of the marble tile. She looked at me with deep, unmasked apprehension. She had witnessed the entire violent collapse from the safety of the catering corridors. She had seen the federal agents physically drag Bradley out in steel handcuffs. She had watched the local police officers forcefully march Monique out the front doors into the freezing night. Carmen possessed the sharp, intuitive survival instincts of a woman who had worked tirelessly in the shadows of the wealthy elite for 2 decades. She knew that when massive estates changed hands and corporate empires burned to the ground, the working-class staff were always the very first casualties. She lowered her gaze to the floor. She asked me in a quiet, trembling voice if she needed to start looking for another job. She asked if the federal government was going to seize her modest pension or lock the doors to the staff quarters. She assumed she was merely collateral damage in a war she had no part in creating. She was entirely wrong. She was the exact reason I had survived the war in the first place. Carmen was not an employee. She was the silent, beating heart of this property. She had worked directly for Sylvia for 20 unbroken years. Long before Bradley and Monique executed their fraudulent takeover, Carmen had managed the daily operations of the house with absolute, unyielding loyalty. When Sylvia passed away and the estate was illegally transferred, Monique had immediately attempted to fire the older staff. Carmen had quietly refused to leave. She endured Monique's daily verbal abuse and Bradley's arrogant dismissals simply to remain close to me. When I was actively being starved and frozen out of my own home, Carmen was the only human being on the property who recognized my existence. She secretly brought hot meals to my small room in the basement. She monitored my blood pressure every single morning with a digital cuff she bought with her own money. She made sure my prescribed heart medications were never mysteriously misplaced by my stepdaughter. Most importantly, Carmen was the one who had taken the ultimate catastrophic risk. When Bradley first brought Dr. Aris into the house to orchestrate the fake dementia diagnosis, Carmen had listened through the library doors. She had smuggled a prepaid cellular phone into my room. She had made the initial desperate phone call to Hayes. She had literally risked her own livelihood and faced severe legal retaliation to hand me the weapon I needed to fight back. I looked at the older woman standing nervously with the broom. I did not offer her a patronizing smile or a vague promise of security. I spoke with absolute uncompromising authority. I ordered her to put the broom down on the floor immediately. I told her that she would never sweep another floor or endure another degrading command in this house for the rest of her natural life. Carmen blinked in sheer confusion. Her hands slowly relaxed and the wooden handle of the broom clattered softly against the marble tiles. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored charcoal wool suit for the final time tonight. I did not pull out a master trust document or a crisp $20 bill. I pulled out a thick, pristine manila envelope. I closed the distance between us and placed the heavy envelope directly into her hands. I instructed her to open it. She pulled back the metal clasp and extracted a stack of dense, legally binding corporate documents. It was a formal ironclad employment contract drafted and authenticated by Hayes earlier that afternoon. I informed her that her position as a domestic housekeeper was officially terminated. I stated that she was immediately promoted to the position of executive estate manager. I detailed the precise financial parameters of the contract. Her annual salary was instantly tripled. The document guaranteed comprehensive premium medical coverage, a fully funded corporate pension plan, and absolute autonomous executive authority over all domestic operations and future hiring protocols. She possessed the legal power to fire the entire remaining catering staff and replace them with her own trusted personnel. I told her that the foundation of loyalty she had provided me was worth exponentially more than any piece of seized diamond jewelry or fraudulent corporate stock. Carmen stared at the bold black ink of the salary figure printed on the first page. The shock completely drained the breath from her lungs. Genuine, silent tears began to rapidly trace paths down her weathered cheeks. These were not the weaponized theatrical tears of a cornered predator trying to manipulate a judge. These were the profound, overwhelming tears of a woman who had spent decades in invisible servitude and had finally been recognized, validated, and permanently secured. She tried to speak, her voice choking on a profound wave of gratitude, but I held up my hand to stop her. I told her that the estate manager position was not a ceremonial title. I explained that she was going to have an immense amount of immediate, highly complex logistical work to oversee. I walked past her and gestured broadly to the cavernous vaulted ceilings of the grand living room. I told her that I had absolutely no desire to live alone in a massive hollow mansion built purely as a monument to false wealth. The structure possessed incredible architectural integrity, but the spirit of the house had been thoroughly poisoned by Bradley and Monique's shallow parasitic greed. I did not want to spend the remaining years of my life pacing through empty hallways lined with microchipped artwork and federal seizure tags. I needed to build something that mattered. I needed to construct a permanent functional legacy that would outlive us both and actively honor Sylvia's memory. I revealed the absolute final phase of my master plan. The estate was zoned for expansive commercial use due to a historical agricultural loophole I had discovered and legally secured decades ago. I informed Carmen that we were not going to maintain this property as a private residence. We were going to completely gut the interior architecture. We were going to actively convert the massive 70,000 square foot structure into a premier, fully funded vocational academy. I spent my youth breaking concrete and hauling steel. I knew the immense transformative power of teaching a desperate person a highly skilled, tangible trade. I was going to turn this estate into a world-class training center for young, underprivileged men and women who needed to learn commercial construction, advanced electrical engineering, and structural architecture. I was going to use Sylvia's massive master trust to fund their tuition, provide their tools, and launch their careers. Carmen wiped her tears. A fierce, resilient light ignited instantly in her dark eyes. She stood taller, her posture shifting from a submissive housekeeper to an empowered executive manager. She nodded sharply, entirely ready for the massive operational pivot. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my contact list and scrolled past the high-priced corporate attorneys and the elite medical specialists. I found the number I had not dialed in 5 years. I initiated the call to the foreman of my original heavy-duty commercial construction crew. The line clicked open. The gruff voice of an industrial contractor echoed through the speaker. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him to mobilize his heavy demolition teams and bring his best structural engineers to my coordinates by sunrise. I told him we had a massive amount of walls to tear down. Exactly 1 month had passed since the federal raid violently cleansed the property of its parasitic infection. The heavy rhythmic pounding of industrial sledgehammers and the mechanical whine of commercial excavators vibrated consistently through the reinforced concrete floor of my personal workshop. I stood at my heavy oak drafting table. The familiar comforting scents of fresh sawdust machine oil and worn leather filled the air. This space had always been my true sanctuary. It was a place of creation far removed from the shallow performative grandiosity of the main estate. Through the large industrial window, I watched a team of 60 union contractors systematically tear out the imported Italian marble and the fragile crystal chandeliers of the main house. They were actively stripping the 70,000 square foot mansion down to its raw structural steel and load-bearing timber. Hayes walked through the heavy wooden door of the workshop. He did not flinch at the deafening sounds of demolition echoing across the acreage. He carried his signature slim leather briefcase and wore a sharp charcoal suit that mirrored my own pragmatic aesthetic. He approached the drafting table and unlatched the brass locks of his briefcase with a crisp, satisfying click. He extracted a thick stack of finalized legal documents, fanning them out across the smooth oak surface. These were not defensive maneuvers or protective injunctions. These were the absolute immutable blueprints of a permanent legacy. I picked up my heavy steel fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I moved systematically through the stack of archival parchment, signing my name with bold, deliberate strokes on every single designated line. With those signatures, I officially and legally severed my personal ownership of the main house and the surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate. I transferred the entirety of the property, fully funded by Sylvia's original master trust, directly into the control of a newly established, aggressively endowed nonprofit foundation. The estate was no longer a monument to elite excess. It was officially registered as a premier commercial engineering and advanced trade academy dedicated entirely to underprivileged black youth. I retained only the small, modest guest annex located at the far southern edge of the property for my personal use. It was a quiet, structurally flawless, and highly efficient space. It required no domestic staff, no grand maintenance, and no performative upkeep. It was exactly the kind of unpretentious, durable home I had always truly desired. I handed the final notarized deed transfer back to Hayes. He inspected the signatures with the clinical precision of a former federal prosecutor, nodded sharply in approval, and slid the heavy document securely back into his briefcase. I looked back out the window at the demolition crews transforming the landscape. The creation of this academy was not a random act of philanthropic vanity. It was a deeply personal, fiercely calculated architectural strike against a cycle of poverty I knew intimately. I grew up in a marginalized, suffocatingly poor neighborhood where the horizon was entirely blocked by systemic barriers and generational neglect. In my youth, there were no corporate internships, no trust funds, and no second chances. The environment was designed to grind young men and women into dust before they ever had a chance to stand up. The absolute only escape route from that crushing poverty was the acquisition of a tangible, highly specialized physical skill. I had to build my own ladder out of the neighborhood from scratch. I built it with bruised knuckles, calloused hands, and decades of brutal, exhausting labor in commercial construction zones. I learned structural engineering by studying blueprints under the dim light of a street lamp. I understood very early that while a bank can foreclose on a house and a corporation can liquidate a stock portfolio, no system on earth can repossess a trade skill. Once you know how to weld high-grade structural steel wire, a commercial electrical grid, or pour a foundation that will last a century, you possess intrinsic, unassailable value. I was going to provide that exact same indestructible ladder to a generation of kids who were currently standing exactly where I had stood 50 years ago. The Academy would offer full-ride scholarships, premium commercial-grade tools, and direct union placement upon graduation. It was designed to manufacture master electricians, lead architects, and senior foremen. Sylvia's wealth was finally going to be utilized to construct permanent intergenerational stability instead of funding temporary shallow luxury. Hayes closed his briefcase and rested his hands on the drafting table. He shifted his posture, moving from his role as an estate attorney back into his mindset as a former federal prosecutor. He looked at me with a sharp, deeply satisfied gleam in his eyes. He informed me that it was time to provide the final comprehensive aftermath report regarding the hostile actors who had foolishly attempted to dismantle my life. The justice system, guided by the flawless evidence we had meticulously compiled, had aggressively and violently corrected itself. Hayes started with Bradley. The federal hammer had come down with absolute, inescapable, crushing force. The undeniable digital trail documenting the embezzlement of $40 million from the private equity firm left Bradley's defense attorneys with absolutely zero leverage. He had no funds to drag out a trial, and the prosecution possessed overwhelming forensic proof of his international wire fraud. Bradley recognized that facing a federal jury would result in a multi-decade sentence. He completely capitulated. He signed a comprehensive plea agreement confessing to every single federal charge in exchange for a guaranteed 10-year sentence. Hayes informed me that Bradley had been officially transferred to a maximum security federal penitentiary in the Midwest just 48 hours ago. He was permanently stripped of his tailored suits, his corporate titles, and his stolen millions. He was now simply a federal inmate facing a decade of bleak, regimented confinement. Next, Hayes delivered the clinical status of Dr. Eris. The corrupt, arrogant psychiatrist who had eagerly accepted Bradley's bribe to forge the fraudulent dementia diagnosis was completely ruined. When Hayes handed the secret library recordings over to the state medical board, their reaction was swift and lethal. They convened an emergency disciplinary hearing and permanently revoked his license to practice medicine. He was entirely stripped of his prestigious clinical credentials. Furthermore, the district attorney had used the recordings to file multiple felony charges against him for medical fraud, criminal conspiracy, and the attempted illegal institutionalization of a healthy citizen. Dr. Eris was currently out on bail, entirely bankrupt from his mounting legal defense fees and facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a state correctional facility. His lucrative, unethical career was permanently eradicated. Finally, Hayes reached the absolute bottom of the parasitic hierarchy. He delivered the ultimate unvarnished truth regarding Monique. The federal asset forfeiture protocols had stripped her of every single luxury item she possessed. She had no college degree, no professional resume, and zero understanding of how to function in the real, unforgiving world. She had attempted to call her wealthy elite circle of country club friends, begging to sleep on their couches or borrow cash. The moment those socialites realized her husband was a convicted federal felon and her mother's estate was completely out of reach, they instantly blocked her number and severed all ties. Her superficial social currency had evaporated entirely. Hayes informed me that Monique was currently working the grueling late-night graveyard shift as a front register cashier at a miserable, grease-stained diner on the extreme outskirts of the city. She was spending her nights standing on aching feet under harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, ringing up cheap coffee and fighting with intoxicated patrons. Every single meager paycheck she earned was being aggressively garnished to pay off the massive legal debts she had incurred during her desperate failed attempt to fight the federal asset seizures. She was living in a cramped, poorly insulated studio apartment, relying entirely on the unreliable public transit system she had once viciously mocked. She was trapped in a perpetual cycle of exhausting physical labor and crushing financial anxiety. She had spent her entire adult life aggressively avoiding honest work, choosing instead to manipulate, belittle, and steal from the people who supported her. Now the universe had forced her into the exact reality she had always considered beneath her. She was finally experiencing the brutal, unyielding weight of the real world without a safety net, a master trust, or a stolen corporate bank account to catch her. I listened to the comprehensive breakdown of their individual downfalls. I did not smile. I did not feel the need to celebrate or gloat over their misery. I simply felt the profound, resonant peace of an architect who had successfully reinforced a crumbling structure. The rot had been completely excised. The parasites had been permanently removed from the ecosystem. I turned my attention back to the massive industrial window. The sun was beginning to set over the sprawling acreage of the estate. The demolition crews were powering down their heavy machinery for the evening, leaving the skeletal frame of the mansion standing strong against the twilight sky. It was ready to be rebuilt. It was ready to serve a genuine purpose. I thanked Hayes for his impeccable work. I walked over to my workbench, picked up my heavy steel wrench, and prepared to start building something new. Exactly 1 month after the federal raid shattered the false foundation of the estate, I stood in the quiet, dust-filtered light of my personal workshop. The heavy rhythmic thud of construction hammers and the high-pitched whine of industrial power saws echoed steadily from the main property. I leaned over my heavy oak drafting table. Hayes stood directly across from me. He unclasped his slim leather briefcase and produced the absolute final stack of legally binding corporate documents. I picked up my heavy steel fountain pen. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I signed my name with bold, deliberate strokes across the bottom of every pristine page. With those precise signatures, I officially and legally transferred the massive 70,000 square foot main house and its surrounding 50 acres of prime real estate into the permanent control of a newly established nonprofit foundation. The sprawling property was officially registered and heavily endowed as a premier engineering and advanced trade program dedicated exclusively to underprivileged Black youth. I retained only the small, structurally flawless guest annex located at the far southern edge of the property for my personal use. It was a modest, highly efficient space that required no performative upkeep. It was exactly the kind of quiet, durable home I had always desired. Hayes collected the notarized deeds and slid them securely back into his briefcase. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket and delivered his final comprehensive status report regarding the hostile actors who had attempted to dismantle my existence. He informed me that the judicial system had aggressively and violently corrected itself. Bradley had completely capitulated under the crushing weight of the federal embezzlement evidence. He had accepted a comprehensive plea deal resulting in a mandatory 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Dr. Aris, the corrupt psychiatrist who had forged the fraudulent medical documents, had been entirely stripped of his medical license by the state board and was currently facing severe felony charges for criminal conspiracy. Finally, Hayes delivered the ultimate unvarnished truth regarding my stepdaughter. Monique was entirely bankrupt. The federal asset forfeiture protocols had seized her entire material existence. She was currently working the grueling, exhausting graveyard shift as a front register cashier at a miserable late-night diner on the extreme outskirts of the city. She was using every single meager paycheck to slowly pay off her massive mounting legal debts. Hayes departed the property shortly after our meeting, leaving me to the profound peace of my new reality. I walked out of the workshop and stepped into the vibrant, blooming garden bordering the front entrance of the estate. The morning air was crisp and unyielding. The sound of young, ambitious apprentices learning how to frame walls and run commercial electrical conduits filled the atmosphere with a fierce, productive energy. I knelt beside a row of budding hydrangeas, carefully pruning the dead branches with my steel shears. A sudden, sharp metallic rattle broke through the steady hum of the trade school. I stood up and looked toward the massive wrought iron security gates at the perimeter of the property. Standing alone on the gravel shoulder of the road was Monique. She did not arrive in an imported luxury vehicle. She had walked up the long, steep suburban hill on foot. She wore a cheap, faded polyester diner uniform. The bright, obnoxious yellow fabric was permanently stained with old grease and cheap coffee. Her posture, once artificially elevated by supreme arrogance and weaponized entitlement, was heavily slumped under the crushing weight of sheer physical exhaustion. Her pristine, expensive designer heels had been replaced by bulky, orthopedically necessary non-slip work shoes. The crisp morning wind bit violently through her thin uniform, causing her entire frame to shiver uncontrollably. Her hands, once adorned with flawless manicures and stolen diamond rings, were bare-chapped and tightly gripping the thick black iron bars of the locked security gate. She stared directly through the metal bars at the massive, professionally mounted bronze plaque secured to the brick pillar. The heavy polished letters read Sylvia and Clifton Trade Academy. A look of absolute paralyzing disbelief washed over her pale face. She watched dozens of young black men and women walking across the manicured lawns carrying heavy toolboxes, surveying equipment and architectural blueprints. Her brain could not process the total transformation of her former royal court into a bustling, functional center of intense physical labor. Monique had spent her entire parasitic life believing that a legacy was something you inherit. She fundamentally believed that wealth, status, and power were divine birthrights simply handed down to her because she possessed a specific bloodline. She expected to consume her mother's fortune without contributing a single ounce of effort to the world. I knew the exact opposite to be true. I grew up in a neighborhood where trade skills were the absolute only escape route from suffocating poverty. I knew that legacy is not something you passively receive. Legacy is something you build with calloused hands, broken fingernails, and relentless integrity. I was actively providing the exact same sturdy, indestructible ladder I had to build from scratch to a generation of kids who desperately needed to climb. Monique rattled the heavy iron gates again. Her knuckles turned stark white against the dark metal. She spotted me standing quietly among the gardenias. She did not attempt to manufacture fake tears. She did not drop to her knees and beg for mercy. She simply unleashed the last pathetic remnants of her shattered entitlement. She screamed my name through the iron bars. Her voice was jagged hoarse from yelling at diner patrons and completely devoid of its former venom. She demanded to know how I could possibly execute such a massive betrayal. She pointed a trembling accusatory finger at the young apprentices walking up the front steps of the main house. She demanded to know how I could legally give away her precious family home to a crowd of total strangers. She shouted that I was destroying her mother's memory. She screamed that I had stolen her rightful sanctuary. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic, shivering desperation. I did not hurl insults or lecture her on the brutal reality of karma. I simply wiped the damp soil from my hands, placed my pruning shears carefully onto a nearby stone bench, and walked slowly toward the perimeter gate. I moved with the steady, measured, and unstoppable momentum of a glacier. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the wrought iron barrier. I looked directly into her bloodshot, exhausted eyes. I projected an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. I spoke in a low, resonant, and deeply flat tone. I corrected her fundamentally flawed perception of reality for the absolute final time. I informed her that she was severely confused about the definition of theft. I stated clearly that I did not give away a family home. I told her that I had simply repurposed a massive, empty brick structure that possessed excellent load-bearing walls. I looked at her shivering hands gripping the cold iron. I told her that the family she was desperately trying to invoke had died a very long time ago entirely by her own malicious, destructive, and greedy hands. I informed her that a house is only a home when the people inside it protect each other. The moment she decided to view me as prey, the property simply became an asset. I had liquidated that asset to build a future for people who actually deserve to thrive. Monique opened her mouth to scream another pathetic, exhausted insult, but the words completely failed to materialize in her throat. The ultimate crushing truth of my statement stripped away her final microscopic layer of self-delusion. She realized with absolute terrifying clarity that I was completely untouchable. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I did not offer her a single dollar for a bus ride back to her miserable diner. I turned my back on her freezing, defeated figure. I walked slowly and purposefully away from the perimeter gates. I headed down the manicured stone pathway toward the quiet, secure sanctuary of my guest annex. As I walked, the vibrant, energetic sounds of young students learning in the main house completely filled the crisp morning air. I heard the sharp, rhythmic pounding of hammers driving nails into solid wood. I heard the loud, confident voices of instructors teaching the complex mathematics of structural engineering. It was the beautiful, undeniable sound of a future permanently secured. The justice system and the universe had aggressively self-corrected. The arrogant, hostile parasites were entirely broken by the sheer, unyielding weight of their own manufactured greed. The humble, the patient, and the dedicated inherited the absolute peace. The silent adjustment was completely finished. True legacy is never found in the inheritance of luxury or the accumulation of status symbols which can be stripped away in an instant by the weight of one's own deceit. Real enduring power is built upon the foundation of hard-earned skills, unshakable integrity, and the courage to endure hardship without compromising one's soul. When you build your life on the shifting sands of greed and manipulation, you are merely constructing a prison of your own making. Character remains the only asset that the world cannot seize, for it is the only currency that truly defines the worth of a man. Have you ever felt the need to rebuild your own life after a moment of profound betrayal? Share your story of resilience in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more life-changing lessons on how to protect your dignity and secure your future.